Something lived in these hills before Ysgramor ever set foot here. It watched him land his ships, and it did not run. Welcome back to the long history of Tamriel. If this is your first night resting with us, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let the ages carry you slowly towards sleep. If you have been here before, welcome home again, back to the standing stones and older stories. You can subscribe if you want more of these quiet journeys through forgotten ages, but for now, just settle in, breathe slowly, and listen to what came before. Long before Skyrim had a name, before Nords crossed the sea in their wooden ships, another people already lived in the Western Highlands. They are known today as the Reach folk. Their history began in cold stone valleys, long before anyone thought to write a single word of it down. What we know of them today comes mostly from theory, broken ruins, and careful guesswork. The Reach folk are believed to carry blood far older than Skyrim itself. Some scholars think their ancestry stretches back to the earliest elves of Tamriel, the Aldmer, whose bloodlines are thought to have drifted west long before recorded history began. Over many generations, that elven blood may have mixed slowly with early human tribes already settled in the highlands. No clear record proves this connection exists. The theory survives instead in weathered bones, in strange bloodlines, and in stories passed between scholars who study the deep past. A few point to burial sites scattered through the region, where skeletal remains show features unlike anything found among early Nordic settlers. Whatever the truth may be, the Reach folk never looked like anyone else in Tamriel. Their faces held something older, something the rest of Skyrim could never fully explain, even centuries later. In the dim light of a Reach dwelling, that ancient blood is said to still show itself, faintly, in the shape of an eye or the line of a jaw. There is a theory that the Reach worshipped stone before it worshipped any named god. Centuries before Nords raised their burial mounds, the Reach folk raised circles of standing stones across the open slopes. Weathered and silent, many of these stones still stand today, facing wind that has not changed in centuries. Historians believe these circles were gathering places for ritual, though the exact ceremonies performed there have been lost completely. This form of worship never matched the 9 divines, and it never matched the Nordic gods either. It stood apart, quieter and stranger, built around forces with no clear name attached to them. Families are believed to have walked for days across the region just to reach one particular circle, favored above all others. In the cold hours before dawn, the stones still hold their same patient shape, waiting for a ceremony no one now remembers how to perform. Moss has claimed most of them, and grass grows tall between their feet, undisturbed for generations. Long before any Nord banner reached the Western Highlands, the Reach may have stood as its own kingdom. Some believe this early kingdom held together under its own rulers, entirely separate from anything happening to the east. If true, this would mean the region had a political identity, long before Skyrim ever existed as one unified land. No single record confirms exactly how this kingdom rose, or exactly how it eventually fell apart. What remains instead is a gap in written history, a kingdom remembered only in careful theory. A few researchers believe its fall came slowly, through drought and quiet famine, rather than through any single war. Somewhere beneath the grass of the western slopes, the outline of that lost rule may still be waiting to be found. A crumbled wall, or a hidden foundation, may be all that remains of a throne no one can name anymore. Carved symbols still mark a few standing stones scattered across the Reach today. Some scholars believe these marks once formed a real system of writing, separate from anything used elsewhere in Tamriel. The patterns repeat in ways that feel too deliberate to be simple decoration. If this theory holds, the region once kept its own written history, entirely apart from any Nord records. That history, if it truly existed, is almost completely gone from the world now. A handful of researchers have tried matching these symbols to other known alphabets, without much success so far. Only a small number remain, facing the wind on lonely hilltops year after year. Whatever story they were meant to hold, the stones have kept it to themselves, refusing to give up their meaning, even to careful study. During the early years of Nord expansion, the Reach did not simply step aside. Its clans held their ground for generations. resisting slowly instead of all at once in open war. Old Nordic accounts describe conflict continuing here, long after most of Skyrim had settled into peace. Some historians describe the Reach as one of the old holds, a territory that existed before Skyrim's holds were properly drawn on any map. As political power gathered further north and east, this region was left to guard its own cold, forgotten corner of the world, mostly on its own terms. Trade routes shifted entirely around the territory, leaving its villages cut off from wealth flowing elsewhere. Even now, that boundary line feels different from the rest of Skyrim, quieter and less settled. Hagravens did not appear evenly across every part of Skyrim. For reasons still not fully understood, they first appeared specifically among Reach covens, tucked deep in the highlands. Hagravens are believed to begin as human witches who complete a painful and secretive transformation late in life. That ritual seems closely tied to regional beliefs, passed through hidden covens across many generations. No surviving record explains clearly why this practice took root here and nowhere else. Some believe the isolation of the highlands let dangerous rituals survive untouched by outside faiths for far longer than elsewhere. A few scholars think the mountains themselves offered privacy no coven elsewhere in Skyrim could count on. Elsewhere, such practices slowly faded into memory. Here, in these slopes, they simply did not fade at all. Briar hearts carry a wooden heart where a human heart once beat. This tradition replaces a warrior's heart with one carved from hawthorn wood, said to grant uncommon strength in battle. Hagravens are thought to perform this ritual, tying the practice to the same covens who never abandoned the region's earliest customs. The true cost of this transformation is rarely spoken of, even among those who study it closely today. Long after Nordic customs spread across the rest of the land, this practice stayed rooted only here, hidden away in the coldest corners of the territory. Some believe the wooden heart carries a piece of the coven itself, binding the warrior to the highlands forever. Few who carry one ever speak of what they gave up to receive it. The Nords eventually gathered under one crown. The Reach never did. Despite sharing a common ancestry, its clans stayed scattered across many small strongholds, instead of uniting under a single ruler. Each clan held its own hill fort, its own witch, and its own quiet grievance against its neighbors. Historians are still unsure why no lasting king ever managed to bind these groups together permanently. Perhaps the terrain itself, steep and endlessly divided, kept the people just as divided as the land they lived on. Rivalries between neighboring clans are said to have outlasted entire Nordic dynasties to the east. Smoke from a dozen small camps still rises separately across these slopes, never joined under one banner. Half-buried hill forts still rise from the grass across the Western Territory. Fortified camps once held entire communities, long before any Nord banner flew above these same ridgelines. Excavated ruins here show layers of habitation older than most nearby Nordic settlements by a wide margin. Some researchers believe these forts were rebuilt again and again, across generations, always on the same patient ground. Tools and pottery found in these layers suggest each generation simply built on top of what came before. Standing near one today, in the wind and quiet, you can still feel how old the stones beneath your feet truly are. Grass has softened their sharp edges, but the shape of the old walls still holds firm beneath it. Why did the region keep resisting long after the rest of Skyrim had settled? Some believe the mountain isolation simply made conquest difficult for any outside power to finish. Others believe it was closer to stubbornness, passed down through generations who never forgot who came first to this land. Records describe uprisings and scattered resistance, continuing for centuries after Nord settlement had already begun elsewhere. This territory was never fully calm, even while the rest of the land slowly settled into a longer peace. Small, forgotten skirmishes survive only in fragments, names lost, outcomes barely noted at all. Somewhere in these hills, that resistance may still be remembered, even now. Reach belief speaks of spirits without names, older than the 9 divines, and older than any Nordic god. These spirits were not worshipped with temples or songs, but with ritual, in caves and stone circles across the region. Some believe this belief system survived precisely because it never needed grand buildings or written scripture to continue. It lived instead in memory, in ritual, and in isolated slopes where outside faiths always struggled to reach. Travelers who camped too near certain caves are said to have described a stillness unlike anywhere else in Skyrim. Even today, faint traces of these beliefs are said to linger in the most remote corners of the territory, largely undisturbed by time. No priest ever wrote these spirits down, and perhaps that was always the point. The Reach folk were here first, in the cold highlands west of Skyrim's greener valleys. Their standing stones remain, their covens remain, their quiet ways remain, tucked into slopes where few travelers ever go. Empires rose and fell far to the east, and still this land stayed much the same through it all. Long after this chapter closes, those same hills will still be standing, holding their silence a little longer than anywhere else in Tamriel. Southern Skyrim hides more than snow and rock. Beneath some of its oldest holds, a much older people once raised towers of pale stone, long before any Nord walked this ground. Their name has faded from most maps, though their walls have not. What remains of them now sits quietly underground, waiting for anyone curious enough to dig. Pale stone towers lie buried under southern Skyrim, hidden beneath layers built by later hands. Ruins at Korkund and deep inside Bithardams show elven design, smooth and pale, unlike anything Nords or Dwemer ever raised themselves. This style belongs to the Aelids, an elven civilization that once ruled much of Cyrodiil in the earliest ages of Tamriel. Their towers there were tall, graceful, and covered in patterns tied to starlight and the night sky. Finding that same style buried this far north raises a real question about how far their reach truly went. Cyrodiil sits far south of Skyrim, across mountains and long, difficult roads that would have taken weeks to cross on foot. An elven outpost this far from home would have needed real reason and real resources to survive out here at all. Trade goods, records, and supplies would all have needed to travel that same long distance, season after season. Whoever built this outpost committed to a journey most settlers would have avoided entirely. Whatever brought them, their pale stone remembers a journey most records never bothered to explain, and never will now. Even the mountains they crossed have no memory of the feet that once climbed them. There is a theory that the Aelids ran a trading colony this far north, long before Skyrim carried that name. Some historians think a small elven settlement could have served as a waypoint, moving goods between Cyrodiil and lands further north across the mountains. This would explain why Aeliid stonework appears so deep underground here, rather than scattered across the surface like a simple abandoned ruin. A trading post would need walls, storage, and shelter, all things a buried foundation could easily represent even now. Narrow storage rooms found within the ruin support this reading, since they resemble supply chambers more than living quarters. No merchant ledger or trade record confirms this theory outright, and none may ever surface at all. What survives instead is only the shape of old rooms, carved with a purpose no one can fully read anymore. Grain stores, narrow corridors, and small chambers all hint at daily use rather than ceremony or worship. If goods once passed through this ground, the rock kept no record of what they were or where they were going. Even the coins, if any once changed hands here, have long since turned to dust or vanished entirely. The Aelids built with pale stone and careful lines, a style found nowhere else in this region of Tamriel. Their architecture favored smooth curves, tall narrow towers, and surfaces etched with delicate patterns tied to the night sky above them. Nordic buildings favored heavy timber and thick stone, built for warmth against the cold northern winters. Dwemer structures favored brass, iron, and deep mechanical halls carved beneath the mountains themselves. Aelid work stood apart from both, lighter in feeling despite its age and considerable weight. Scholars who study these hidden rooms often note how differently they were shaped, as though built for a very different climate entirely. Some believe the design reflects warmer southern origins, never intended to withstand snow or freezing wind at all. A civilization built for starlight and open air, ended up resting beneath frost it was never designed to survive. Whoever raised these towers clearly did not plan for snow, and yet snow found them anyway, centuries later, sealing them in twice over. The builders who once walked these halls likely never felt a single northern winter themselves. Builders in later ages did not clear these ruins away. Instead, they raised new walls directly on top of them, layer after layer, across many generations. This choice seems strange at first, since clearing old rock would have been simpler than working carefully around it. Some think superstition kept the Aelid foundations untouched, a quiet fear of disturbing something, sealed away for good reason. Others believe it was simple practicality, since a solid old foundation saves considerable time and effort for anyone constructing new walls above it later on. Either way, the pattern repeats at more than one site across southern Skyrim's oldest holds. New structures rise, generation after generation, always resting on the same patient elven bones below their feet. Whether out of respect, fear, or simple convenience, no one ever chose to dig the old rooms out completely, even when it would have been easier to start fresh. Something about the buried rooms seemed to demand caution, even from builders who never learned who had made them. Centuries after the Aelids vanished from this ground, Dwemer engineers raised Bethardams directly above their forgotten foundation. Excavated levels beneath the visible ruin show a clear, unmistakable separation between two very different building styles, entirely. The lower Aelid layer uses pale stone and elegant curves, while the Dwemer level above uses brass, gears, and heavy iron framework entirely. This kind of layering suggests the Dwemer knew exactly what lay beneath their new halls before they ever began construction there at all. Whether they simply repurposed the space or treated it as sacred ground worth building carefully around remains unclear from surviving records. Some Dwemer inscriptions found nearby hint at real curiosity about the older structure below, though nothing conclusive has ever been properly translated. Two entirely different civilizations, centuries apart, chose the very same patch of ground to call their own, one resting directly on top of the other. Neither left behind any sign that they understood who had come before them, or cared to ask. Few records mention Akund by name, though its walls carry unmistakable Aelid design throughout every surviving chamber. What little survives suggests a modest settlement rather than a grand city, more outpost than capital. Its rooms are narrow, its halls short, built more for daily function than for ceremony or public display. This modest scale supports the idea that Akund served a practical purpose rather than a symbolic one, built to work quietly rather than to impress anyone passing through. A small colony, tucked into southern Skyrim, would not need grand halls or towering monuments to serve its function well. No inscriptions found there name a ruler, a god, a founder, or even a single founding date for later scholars to properly study. Even its true name may not be Rakund at all, since that word comes from later maps rather than any Aelid source. Whatever purpose it held, Rakund kept its business quiet, leaving barely a trace for later ages to properly identify. A name given by strangers long after its people were gone is often all that remains of a place like this. Skyrim is remembered for cold roads and northern trade, running mostly toward the coast and its eastern holds. Beneath one southern region, however, a very different road may have once run through here entirely. Some researchers believe a forgotten route once connected these buried ruins directly to Cyrodiil, carrying goods across mountain passes, long since abandoned and forgotten. Such a route would explain both the location of these ruins and their surprising distance from the Aelid heartland far to the south. Roads like this rarely survive in any physical form, worn away by centuries of weather and disuse over time. Occasional worn stones, found in odd alignment across open hillsides, may be the last visible trace of such a path. Farmers in the area have long noticed strange straight lines in certain fields, though few connect them to any old road. A road built for elven feet, centuries before Skyrim had roads of its own, would leave only the faintest trace by now. A route once walked by elven traders may now be nothing more than an ordinary hillside, indistinguishable from the land around it. Anyone crossing it today would have no reason to guess at the feat that once wore a path into that same ground. Miners working near these buried structures report a low humming sound coming from somewhere beneath the rock. This sound has been noted by several separate mining crews across many different years, always near the deepest alleged layers of the ruin. No clear source for the sound has ever been confirmed by anyone studying the site closely. Some suggest it comes from shifting stone, settling slowly under the enormous weight pressing down above it. Others wonder whether some old alien mechanism, long dormant, still holds a faint trace of function deep beneath the surface. A few miners have reportedly refused to work certain tunnels after hearing it more than once. No instrument brought down into the tunnels has ever managed to properly record or explain it. Whatever causes it, the sound has never once led anyone to a clear answer, only to more careful listening. Some crews now simply work around the sound, treating it as just another part of the mountain. Alien survivors may have fled north when their empire collapsed, carrying their building style into unfamiliar, colder land far from home. The Alien Empire in Cyrodiil fell hard, torn apart by slave rebellion and internal collapse many centuries ago. A theory holds that scattered groups, fleeing that chaos, made their way north into what would later become Skyrim entirely. Building in the only style their hands truly knew, these refugees may have raised smaller versions of their old southern towers here in secret. Over time, without support or contact from their fallen homeland, such a colony could have quietly faded rather than fallen in any dramatic way. No war record or battle account marks the end of this settlement, only its slow and total silence. Whatever community once lived here simply stopped appearing in any record at all, without explanation, without warning, and without any final word left behind. If true, this hidden stone may be the last physical trace an entire fleeing people ever left behind. No song or story ever carried their names forward, only these quiet walls left standing in the dark. Why the Aelids chose this exact spot, far from their southern heartland, is not fully explained by any surviving record. The ground here offers stone, water, and shelter, resources any new settlement would reasonably need to survive its first difficult winter. Its position also sits along natural routes through the mountains, useful for both defense and travel alike. Some believe the site was chosen carefully, for these practical reasons alone, rather than for any symbolic purpose. Others wonder whether an older, more spiritual reason drew them to this particular stretch of ground instead. A few scholars point to alignments between certain ruined walls and specific stars, though this remains firmly unconfirmed. If the alignment theory holds any truth, this location may have mattered to the Aelids for reasons entirely separate from trade or defense. Whatever reasoning shaped that first decision, the choice outlived the people who made it by many long centuries. The ground remembers their decision even now, long after any reason for it has been forgotten. The Aelid Empire fell in Cyrodiil, torn down by rebellion and time, but something of it may never have truly left Skyrim's southern hills. Its towers here were buried, not destroyed, resting quietly under everything built above them since that distant collapse. Dwemer halls rose over their foundations, and Nordic settlements grew across their old boundaries, yet the pale stone endured beneath it all regardless. Long after every empire connected to this ground has fallen, that same pale stone remains exactly where it was first laid down. Whoever comes next will build on top of it too, most likely, never knowing whose hands shaped it first. Ages will keep turning above it, and the stone will keep its silence a while longer. There is a Daedric prince whose shrine sits far from any road, tucked into a grotto few travelers ever choose to find on purpose. Periite governs order and disease, a strange pairing that few mortals ever fully understand. His shrine rests deep inside Bloated Man's grotto, hidden well away from any major city or trade route. Some believe this isolation was never an accident, but a choice made carefully by Periite himself. A hidden cult can survive quietly for centuries, while a visible one draws attention, rivals, and eventually ruin. Other Daedric shrines sit closer to roads and settlements, drawing pilgrims and curious travelers alike. Periite's shrine draws almost no one, and perhaps that was always the intended design. A prince who values order may simply prefer a cult that stays small, controlled, and rarely noticed by outsiders. Hidden this deep in the earth, his worship continues undisturbed, exactly as he may have always wanted it. Peryite is known as the prince who governs the order of the lowest things, a title that confuses most who hear it. Some scholars believe this means he rules over small, overlooked tasks that keep the world quietly functioning. Disease, decay, and minor sickness all fall under things most people would rather ignore entirely. Yet these lowest things touch every mortal life eventually, whether feared or simply forgotten about. A theory suggests Peryite's true role is far larger than his humble title implies. Order, after all, depends on small details working correctly, not only on grand laws or kings. Without disease and decay following their proper course, the entire natural order might slowly unravel. Perhaps Peryite's power sits quietly underneath everything else, holding a role most mortals never think to properly credit. Among the Daedric Princes, Peryite often ranks near the bottom in raw power and fear. Older texts describe him as one of the weaker princes, easily overshadowed by figures like Mehrunes Dagon or Molag Bal. Some question whether this ranking reflects true weakness, or simply a difference in how power gets measured. Peryite does not seek war, conquest, or destruction the way many other princes openly do. His influence works slowly, through disease and quiet decay, rather than through sudden violence or open conflict. A power that spreads unseen may be harder to measure, though not necessarily smaller in its final effect. Some believe mortals simply fear what they can see coming, not what creeps in silently over time. Peryite's true strength may be resting quietly in exactly that difference. Travelers near Bloated Man's Grotto have reported strange signs of sickness spreading through nearby plant life and small animals. Rot appears in places that should not yet be rotting, and animals fall ill without any clear cause nearby. Some believe these are simply natural signs of decay, unrelated to anything Daedric at all. Others see them as omens, quiet warnings, tied directly to Peryite's presence somewhere close by. A prince of disease might leave small, unmistakable signs wherever his influence lingers longest. These signs never announce themselves loudly, staying subtle enough that most travelers walk past without noticing. Only those already searching for Peryite tend to notice these strange, quiet warnings at all. The grotto seems to whisper its danger, rather than shout it outright to anyone passing through. Peryite's followers are known for staying unusually quiet, even compared to other Daedric cults across Skyrim. Some believe this quietness is a deliberate choice, meant to avoid drawing attention from rival cults and hunters alike. Other Daedric worshippers, like followers of Boethia or Molag Bal, often draw notice through violence or open ritual. Peryite's followers instead prefer isolation, small gatherings, and careful secrecy above all else. A theory holds that this restraint reflects Peryite's own nature, valuing order and control over spectacle or fear. Staying hidden also protects a small cult from being wiped out entirely by more aggressive rivals. Fewer enemies notice a group that never announces itself in the first place. This quiet approach may be the very reason Peryite's cult has survived so long, largely unnoticed. Some scholars argue that Peryite's low rank among the princes says more about mortals than about Peryite himself. Fear tends to follow what threatens mortal life directly and immediately, not what works slowly underneath the surface. Disease kills slowly, over weeks or years, rather than in one sudden and dramatic moment. This slower pace may explain why so few mortals fear Peryite, the way they fear other, louder princes. A quiet death, spread out over time, rarely inspires the same terror as sudden violence does. Yet disease has shaped mortal history far more deeply than most single battles ever could. Peryite's quiet influence may simply be too slow and subtle for most mortals to properly notice or fear. Few descriptions of Peryite's true appearance survive in any consistent form across different accounts. Some texts describe him as insect-like, covered in small, moving parts that never quite settle into stillness. This unsettling description may reflect his connection to decay, disease, and constant small change. A prince without a single stable image may be harder for mortals to fully picture or fear directly. Other Daedric princes have clear, consistent forms that appear again and again across old records. Periite's shifting description suggests something less fixed, more like a process than a single fixed being. Perhaps this vague, uncertain appearance is fitting for a prince tied so closely to slow decay itself. Periite is sometimes called the taskmaster, a title tied closely to order, obedience, and rigid structure. Some believe this title reveals a side of Periite closer to a strict overseer than any typical Daedric prince. His quests, where they exist, often involve completing precise tasks rather than any grand or violent conquest. This structured approach differs sharply from princes, who reward chaos, cruelty, or unpredictable behavior. A theory suggests Periite values mortals who work quietly and follow clear rules without complaint. Rebellion against him is treated as disorder, something Periite's nature seems built to correct, rather than punish harshly. This makes his cult feel less like worship, and closer to service under a very demanding master. No grand temple has ever been built for Periite, anywhere in recorded history across Tamriel. Unlike princes such as Mehrunes Dagon or Boethia, no city or kingdom has openly worshipped Periite as a central deity. Some believe this absence reflects his low standing among mortals, who rarely think to worship disease and order. Others suggest Periite himself has little interest in grand temples or widespread public devotion at all. A prince focused on small, quiet order may prefer modest shrines over towering monuments built for show. This preference would explain why his few known shrines remain small, hidden, and largely unremarkable in appearance. Grand or not, his influence continues regardless, working quietly through disease rather than through impressive stone architecture. Periite does not live in time the way mortals do, though his influence still touches mortal history again and again. Plagues rise and fall across the ages, and some believe his hand rests quietly behind many of them. Long after this age passes, disease will likely still exist, spreading slowly and touching mortal lives in quiet ways. Periite needs no grand temple, no army, and no fear-filled worship to remain a lasting presence in the world. His shrine will stay buried in its grotto, hidden and mostly forgotten by nearly everyone. And somewhere in the slow spread of illness across Tamriel, his quiet order continues, unnoticed, exactly as he seems to prefer it. Far to the south, an empire was tearing itself apart. Few in Skyrim's southern holds understood how deeply that chaos would reach into their own quiet lives. Long before Skyrim held its current borders, the First Era saw Cyrodiil consumed by political unrest, rebellion, and shifting loyalties. This chaos rarely touched northern history books directly, yet its effects moved quietly across the mountains, into Skyrim's southern reaches. Falkreath, sitting closest to that troubled southern border, absorbed much of what spilled over. Families fleeing violence, food shortages, and collapsing local rule often traveled north, searching for calmer land to settle. Some historians believe a real wave of refugees reached Falkreath during this period, arriving in small groups rather than any single migration. These newcomers brought different customs, different faces, and bloodlines that slowly mixed into the existing population there. Old genealogical records, incomplete as they are, show unusual gaps and sudden new names appearing in Falkreath's registries around this time. A theory holds that some modern Falkreath families descend directly from these southern refugees, their true origins forgotten generations ago. No one alive today could easily prove such ancestry, since records from this chaotic period remain thin and unreliable at best. What remains instead is a quiet suspicion, passed down more as rumor than fact, that Falkreath's people carry blood from a war few even remember by name. Minor holdlords along Skyrim's southern border found themselves in a curious position during this unrest. Refugees needed food, shelter, and safe passage, and local lords controlled exactly those resources. Some historians believe certain lords quietly profited from selling grain, tools, and lodging at inflated prices to desperate travelers. This kind of quiet profiteering rarely appears in official records, since no lord would openly admit to exploiting suffering neighbors. Yet scattered mentions in old estate ledgers hint at unusual wealth appearing in specific southern holds during this exact period. A theory suggests this sudden prosperity funded early fortifications, expanded landholdings, or improved status for a handful of ambitious families. Whether this wealth came through fair trade or opportunistic pricing remains impossible to confirm from what little survives. Some scholars argue any lord in that position would have made similar choices, given the chaos surrounding them. Others see something more calculating in how quickly certain holds grew wealthier, while others nearby stayed poor and struggling. This quiet profiteering, if real, never earned songs or open praise, since prosperity built on crisis rarely invites celebration. It remains instead a private theory, tucked into old numbers, that no longer mean much to anyone still living. Unexplained ruins near Skyrim's southern border have long puzzled travelers who stumble across them unexpectedly. These structures show clear signs of military design, walls built for defense rather than daily living or trade. Some historians believe these ruins mark the remains of a lost garrison, stationed here during the height of southern unrest. Such a garrison would have guarded the border against refugees, raiders, or fleeing soldiers crossing north without permission. No clear record names this garrison, its commander, or the exact reason for its eventual abandonment. A theory suggests it was simply forgotten once the southern chaos finally settled, its purpose no longer needed by anyone. Soldiers stationed there may have quietly drifted into nearby settlements, blending into local life rather than returning south. Others believe the garrison fell during some unrecorded skirmish, its defenders lost to violence that history simply failed to preserve. Weapons and armor fragments found nearby support the idea that fighting once happened at this exact spot, though no account explains what triggered it. Whatever unfolded here, the ruins kept their silence far longer than any garrison would have kept its post. Some of Skyrim's oldest noble families claim ancestry stretching back further than most local histories can properly confirm. A theory holds that certain of these families first rose to prominence directly through this period of southern chaos. Opportunities for advancement, wealth, or new landholdings often appear during unstable times, when old structures weaken and new ones can form quickly. A minor family with resources, connections, or simple good timing could rise sharply while established powers struggled elsewhere. Some genealogists point to gaps in noble records around this exact era, where humble families suddenly appear holding significant land or title. Whether these families earned their rise through service, opportunism, or simple fortune remains impossible to say with any certainty now. What survives instead is a pattern, repeated across several noble lines, of sudden prominence appearing during otherwise poorly documented decades. This pattern alone cannot prove direct connection to southern unrest, though the timing invites real suspicion among careful historians. Noble families rarely advertise humble or opportunistic origins, preferring instead grander stories tied to heroism or ancient rite. Somewhere beneath those grander stories, a quieter truth about timing and circumstance may still be waiting, mostly undisturbed. Remarkably little survives from this period compared to records covering other eras of Skyrim's early history. Some historians find this gap itself worth serious attention, wondering why documentation from such an eventful time proved so thin. Chaos rarely produces careful record-keeping, since scribes and administrators often have more urgent concerns than preserving paperwork. Buildings burned, administrations collapsed, and many local record-keepers likely fled or died during the worst of the unrest. A theory suggests entire archives may have simply been lost, rather than never created in the first place. Others wonder whether certain records were deliberately destroyed later, hiding uncomfortable details about profiteering, opportunism, or quiet betrayal during the crisis. Whatever the reason, historians studying this period must rely heavily on fragments, rumors, and careful guesswork rather than firm documentation. This absence shapes how the entire era gets remembered, reduced to vague mentions rather than detailed accounts. A war significant enough to reshape bloodlines and noble families left surprisingly little written trace of its own existence. Perhaps that absence itself says something quiet about how thoroughly this period unsettled everything it touched. Falkreath's early architecture shows a curious mix of styles that some historians link directly to this period of southern migration. Certain building techniques, unusual for typical Nordic construction, appear in some of Falkreath's oldest surviving structures. A theory suggests refugee builders, arriving from southern regions, brought their own methods and slowly blended them into local practice. This would explain small architectural details that otherwise seem out of place for a settlement founded on purely Nordic tradition. Roof angles, door placements, and certain stonework patterns differ subtly from equivalent structures found elsewhere in Skyrim. Such differences rarely survive by accident, suggesting deliberate choices made by builders trained somewhere entirely different. Whether this reflects southern refugee influence or simply local innovation remains a matter of ongoing scholarly disagreement. Few records document who actually built these early structures, leaving architecture itself as the primary evidence available today. A building style can outlast the people who created it, quietly preserving traces of migration long after names and stories fade. Falkreath's oldest walls may still be telling a story most of its current residents never think to ask about. Border skirmishes during this period likely occurred far more often than any surviving record properly documents. Small conflicts between local militias, fleeing soldiers, and opportunistic raiders would rarely earn mention in official histories. A theory holds that dozens of minor clashes happened along the southern border, each too small to matter beyond its immediate moment. These skirmishes shaped local memory far more than official history, passed down instead through family stories and oral tradition. Some old Falkreath families still tell vague stories of ancestors fighting off southern raiders, though details rarely match any known historical event. Whether these stories preserve real memory or simply folklore shaped by centuries of retelling remains genuinely unclear. What seems likely is that ordinary people experienced real danger and real loss during this period, regardless of what official records chose to preserve. History remembers empires, kings, and named battles, while these smaller, personal conflicts simply fade from formal memory. Yet they shaped real lives, real losses, and real decisions about where to settle or flee entirely. Somewhere in Falkreath's oldest ghost stories and family legends, fragments of this forgotten violence may still be quietly preserved. Trade patterns shifted noticeably along Skyrim's southern border during this chaotic period, according to what fragmented records survive. Goods that once moved freely between Cyrodiil and Skyrim slowed considerably, disrupted by unrest and dangerous roads. Some merchants likely avoided the region entirely, seeking safer routes further east, or simply waiting out the worst of the chaos. A theory suggests this disruption pushed local holds toward greater self-sufficiency, developing their own resources rather than relying on southern trade. This shift may have permanently altered how southern Skyrim approached farming, craft, and local production long after the unrest finally ended. Some historians credit this period with pushing Falkreath toward the more self-reliant character it maintained for centuries afterward. Necessity, born from crisis, often produces lasting change that outlives the crisis itself by many generations. Whether this theory holds fully true remains uncertain, given how little direct evidence survives from the period itself. What seems reasonably clear is that southern Skyrim could not simply continue as before, while its trade partner collapsed into chaos next door. Old habits, broken by necessity, rarely return exactly as they were once the original crisis finally passes. Religious practice in southern Skyrim shows subtle shifts that some scholars connect to this period of southern unrest and migration. Refugees arriving from Cyrodiil likely carried their own religious customs, blending gradually with existing Nordic tradition already established locally. Small shrine variations, found in some of Falkreath's oldest religious sites, differ subtly from equivalent shrines elsewhere in Skyrim. A theory suggests these variations reflect quiet religious blending, as southern practices merged slowly into northern tradition over generations. Such blending rarely happens through any single dramatic event, instead occurring gradually as communities live and worship alongside each other. Whether specific southern deities or practices survived this blending remains difficult to confirm from what little evidence exists today. Some believe certain minor local traditions, unique to Falkreath, may trace their roots directly to this quiet religious mixing. Others argue any differences reflect simple local variation, unrelated to southern influence at all. This disagreement likely will never fully resolve, given how little clear documentation survives from religious practice during this period. What remains is a subtle pattern, suggestive rather than conclusive, hinting at quiet cultural exchange during a genuinely chaotic time. Southern Skyrim's oldest surviving maps show boundary lines that shifted noticeably during this period of unrest and reorganization. Some historians believe these shifts reflect real changes in who controlled which territory, driven by the chaos spilling over from the south. Minor holds may have expanded or contracted based on which lords proved capable of managing the crisis effectively. A theory suggests some boundary disputes, still lingering in later Skyrim history, actually originated during this poorly documented period. Without clear records explaining exactly how or why these boundaries shifted, later generations were left to settle disputes through tradition, memory, or simple continued practice. This uncertain origin may explain why certain border disagreements between southern holds persisted for centuries afterward, never fully resolved by clear precedent. Old maps, however imprecise, still hint at a period when southern Skyrim's political geography was far less settled than it later became. Whatever boundaries exist today likely owe something to decisions made hastily during this distant, chaotic period. Few who draw modern maps ever consider how much their lines owe to a crisis. Most records barely mention at all. Skyrim's southern holds emerged from this period, changed in ways few contemporary accounts bothered to properly explain. Bloodlines had shifted, quiet fortunes had formed, and boundaries had settled into patterns that would last for centuries afterward. The war itself left almost no direct trace in official memory, overshadowed by larger, better documented conflicts elsewhere in Tamriel's history. Yet its quiet effects lingered in family names, local architecture, and boundaries that outlasted anyone who remembered why they existed. Time moved on, as it always does, burying this chaotic period beneath centuries of more prominent history. Somewhere in Falkreath's oldest bloodlines and quietest boundary disputes, that forgotten unrest still lingers, patient and mostly unnoticed. A soul, once trapped inside a gem, cannot speak. It cannot explain what it felt in that final moment of capture. Black soul gems and white soul gems behave differently, though both serve the same basic purpose of holding a captured soul. White soul gems can only hold souls from lesser creatures, animals, and simple beasts found across Tamriel. Black soul gems, by contrast, can hold the souls of sentient beings, including men and mer of every kind. This difference is not simply about size or storage capacity, but about something deeper in how each gem interacts with a soul. Some scholars believe black soul gems are altered through dark magic, corrupted specifically to accept souls that would otherwise resist capture entirely. A sentient soul carries awareness, memory, and will, qualities that make it naturally harder to contain than a simple animal spirit. This theory suggests black soul gems do not simply store a soul, but actively suppress its resistance during the entire process. Whatever the true mechanism, the difference between these two gem types reflects a boundary magic itself seems reluctant to cross casually. A soul, when targeted for capture, may not simply surrender without some form of resistance during the process. Some believe a strong-willed or highly aware soul can partially resist capture, delaying or weakening the trapping spell's full effect. If true, This resistance might explain why some captures fail entirely, leaving the caster with an empty, useless gem. A soul that resists successfully might return fully to its body, though possibly weakened or altered by the struggle involved. Others theorize a partially resisting soul could leave the body incomplete, neither fully captured nor fully intact afterward. This incomplete state might explain rare reports of corpses behaving strangely after a failed or partial soul-trapping attempt. No clear record confirms exactly what such resistance looks like from an outside observer's perspective. What remains is a theory built from gaps, absences, and stories of soul traps that simply did not work as expected. Once trapped inside a gem, a soul's experience of time remains entirely unknown to anyone outside that small, contained space. Some believe trapped souls retain full awareness, experiencing what feels like endless time frozen inside their tiny prison. This theory suggests trapping a soul may be a quiet form of suffering, regardless of the caster's original intention. Others believe a trapped soul loses all awareness immediately, existing more like stored energy than any kind of conscious experience. If true, this would make soul trapping closer to simple storage, without any suffering attached to the process at all. No soul has ever returned from a gem to describe its own experience, leaving this question entirely unanswerable through direct testimony. Enchanters who work closely with soul gems report no signs one way or the other, only silence from the stone itself. Whatever a trapped soul experiences, or fails to experience, remains locked away as completely as the soul itself. A soul removed from a body may leave behind more than simple death, according to some theories about the trapping process. Some believe a body drained of its soul shows subtle physical differences compared to one that died through ordinary means. Skin tone, temperature retention, or even the specific stillness of the corpse might differ in ways only careful observers would notice. This theory suggests a soul carries something beyond simple awareness, perhaps a final trace of warmth or animation that lingers briefly after death. Others argue any such differences are imagined, with soul-trapped corpses behaving identically to any other corpse under similar conditions. Few necromancers or healers have documented careful physical comparisons, leaving this question mostly unresolved through direct evidence. What little anecdotal evidence exists remains inconsistent, described differently by different observers under different circumstances. Whether a soul leaves any trace behind, physical or otherwise, remains one of soul magic's quieter, unanswered questions. Casting Soul Trap repeatedly over many years may leave a lasting mark on the caster themselves, according to certain theories. Some believe frequent soul trapping gradually numbs a caster's connection to their own soul, wearing down empathy or awareness over time. This theory suggests repeated exposure to captured souls creates a kind of distance, a caster growing, used to treating souls as simple resources. Others believe the practice leaves no lasting change at all, remaining purely mechanical regardless of how often it gets performed. Some enchanters, who work constantly with soul gems, report feeling nothing unusual, describing the process as entirely routine after enough repetition. Others speak vaguely of feeling distant or hollow after years of frequent soul trapping, though such reports remain difficult to verify. Whether this reflects a real magical effect or simply the psychological toll of handling souls as commodities remains genuinely unclear. What seems consistent is that soul trapping, however routine it becomes, is rarely discussed openly among those who practice it most. The exact mechanism separating a soul from a body remains only partially understood, even among skilled practitioners of soul magic. Some believe the spell targets a specific tether connecting body and soul, severing it cleanly at the precise moment of death. Others suggest the process works more gradually, drawing the soul loose rather than cutting it away in one sudden motion. This distinction matters for understanding whether soul trapping causes any pain or disruption beyond death itself. A clean severing suggests minimal additional suffering, while a gradual drawing suggests something closer to extraction, potentially far less gentle. No definitive text explains which model accurately describes the true process, leaving practitioners to rely on assumption and tradition. Some soul magic texts hint at both possibilities, without ever settling the question definitively one way or the other. Whatever the true mechanism, it operates quickly enough that no living soul has ever paused mid-capture to describe it clearly. Soul gems themselves show physical changes once filled, glowing faintly with color that empty gems never display. Some believe this glow reflects the actual presence of a soul, a visible sign of something otherwise entirely invisible. Others suggest the glow is simply a magical reaction to captured energy, unrelated to any true awareness or presence within the stone. This distinction shapes how enchanters think about the gems they use, whether as vessels for consciousness or simply charged magical batteries. A gem treated as a vessel for consciousness might be handled with more care than one treated as pure energy storage. Few enchanters discuss this distinction openly, treating the practical function of soul gems as more important than any philosophical question underneath. Whatever the glow truly represents, it remains the only outward sign that something has changed inside an otherwise ordinary stone. Larger, more powerful souls fill soul gems more completely than smaller, weaker ones, according to well-documented enchanting practice. This suggests some measurable quality, a kind of soul weight or size, exists and can be captured in varying amounts. Some scholars believe this measurable quality reflects a soul's overall life experience, power, or complexity accumulated over a lifetime. Others believe it simply reflects raw magical potential, unrelated to memory, personality, or lived experience in any meaningful way. This distinction matters for understanding what exactly gets stored inside a filled soul gem beyond its practical enchanting value. If soul size reflects lived experience, then trapped souls may carry something closer to identity rather than simple raw power. If it reflects only magical potential, then a trapped soul may be closer to fuel than to any captured person. No enchanting text fully resolves this question, leaving it as one of soul magic's quieter, unexamined mysteries. Souls belonging to the same person, captured at different points in their life, might theoretically differ from each other in subtle ways. Some believe a soul captured late in life, after decades of experience, would differ meaningfully from one captured young. This theory suggests souls are not fixed or static, but instead change gradually alongside the person who carries them. Others argue a soul remains essentially constant throughout life, with only the body and mind changing around it over time. No soul has ever been captured twice from the same person at different ages, making this theory impossible to test directly. What remains is pure speculation, built from broader questions about what a soul actually represents, beyond simple animating force. Whether souls grow, change, or stay fixed throughout a lifetime remains unanswered by any soul gem ever recovered. The gem itself gives no indication of when, or at what age, its captured soul first began its long journey. A soul gem, once emptied of its captured soul, returns to an inert, ordinary state, seemingly unchanged by what it once held. Some believe this complete emptiness suggests the gem itself was never truly altered, serving only as a temporary container throughout the process. Others wonder whether repeated use leaves some faint trace, undetectable through ordinary means, accumulated slowly across many captures and releases. If true, an old, frequently used soul gem might differ subtly from a freshly mined one, despite appearing identical to any observer. No instrument or spell has ever confirmed such a difference, leaving this question entirely theoretical for now. What remains certain is that an emptied gem accepts a new soul just as readily as one that has never been used at all. Whether it remembers anything from what it once briefly held, no gem has ever given any sign either way. Soul magic remains one of Tamriel's quieter mysteries, practiced constantly, yet understood only partially by those who use it most. Every filled gem raises the same unanswered questions, regardless of how routine the practice has become for most enchanters. Somewhere between a captured soul and an empty gem, a boundary exists that magic can cross but never fully explain. This is a sensitive topic for some, and if these questions ever touch something more personal, It may help to talk it through with someone you trust. An elf once governed a human empire, and for a time, that empire simply let him. Potentate Okato rose to lead the Elder Council after Emperor Uriel Septim VII's line ended without a clear successor. This left Cyrodiil and the wider empire under the guidance of a Altmer administrator rather than any human emperor. Skyrim, proud of its Nordic identity and often resistant to outside elven influence, might have been expected to resist this arrangement strongly. Yet no major rebellion rose specifically against Okato's rule from within Skyrim's own holds during this period. Some historians believe this reflects practical concerns outweighing cultural resistance, since Skyrim depended on imperial stability for trade and security. Others suggest Okato's rule was distant enough that many in Skyrim barely felt its daily presence at all. Distance from Cyrodiil may have softened whatever resentment might otherwise have grown into open resistance. Whatever the reason, an elf governed without a crown, and Skyrim's holds largely continued their lives undisturbed by that fact. Some historians believe northern nobles quietly negotiated favorable treatment with Okato's administration in exchange for continued loyalty and stability. Official records rarely document such negotiations directly, since diplomatic arrangements often happened through private correspondence rather than public decree. A theory suggests certain jarls received reduced tribute, expanded local authority, or other quiet concessions during Okato's time in power. This would explain why open rebellion never gained traction, even among nobles who privately resented elven administration over a human empire. Loyalty, in this reading, was purchased through practical benefit rather than earned through genuine respect or affection. Other historians argue no clear evidence supports formal negotiation, suggesting instead that simple pragmatism kept northern nobles quiet without any explicit deal. Whether through secret arrangement or simple practical calculation, Skyrim's nobles found reasons to tolerate what culture alone might have made them resist. Somewhere in old correspondence, if any survives, the true nature of this arrangement might still be waiting to be properly understood. Okato's death came through assassination, carried out by an agent working for the Mythic Dawn during the wider chaos of the Oblivion Crisis. Official accounts describe this assassination as part of a broader plot targeting imperial leadership during a moment of maximum vulnerability. Some theories suggest deeper motives existed beyond the immediate crisis, tied to resentment simmering quietly within the empire's own structure. A few historians wonder whether northern factions, frustrated by elven rule, saw the chaos as convenient cover for a resolution they privately welcomed. No evidence directly implicates any northern noble in the assassination itself, and most historians treat this theory as speculation rather than fact. Yet the theory persists, suggesting Okato's rule, however tolerated outwardly, still generated resentment that never found open expression until his death created opportunity. Whether this resentment played any real role, or whether the assassination was purely opportunistic amid wider chaos, remains genuinely unclear. His death marked the effective end of the potentate system, and with it, direct elven administration over the empire. Some of Okato's administrative reforms may have quietly outlasted his rule, embedded into later Skyrim lore without clear credit or acknowledgement. Bureaucratic efficiency, standardized taxation methods, and certain legal procedures introduced during his administration show similarities to practices continued long afterward. A theory suggests these reforms proved useful enough that later rulers kept them, regardless of who had originally introduced them. Credit for administrative improvement rarely survives political transition, especially when the original architect belonged to a resented or unpopular era. This would explain why Okato's specific contributions rarely appear in later legal histories, despite apparent continuity in practice. Other historians argue any similarities reflect independent development, rather than direct inheritance from Okato's specific administrative choices. Whether Skyrim's later legal structure owes a quiet debt to elven administration remains a matter of ongoing scholarly disagreement. Somewhere in old legal codes, buried beneath centuries of revision, Okato's careful bureaucratic hand may still be quietly present. Surviving records say remarkably little about Okato's specific relationship with Skyrim, compared to detailed accounts of his dealings with Cyrodiil directly. Most chronicles focus heavily on imperial city politics, leaving Skyrim's holds as a distant, barely mentioned periphery throughout his administration. Some historians believe this reflects genuine distance, with Okato focusing his attention primarily on the empire's political and cultural center. Others suggest this gap reflects deliberate omission, perhaps to avoid drawing attention to arrangements or tolerances northern nobles preferred kept quiet. A theory holds that Skyrim's relative silence in these records was itself a form of diplomacy, avoiding scrutiny that closer attention might invite. This silence makes reconstructing Okato's true northern policy difficult, forcing historians to rely on inference rather than direct documentation. Whatever the reason for this gap, it leaves Okato's specific relationship with Skyrim as one of the era's quieter, less examined mysteries. Cyrodiil remembers him vividly, while Skyrim's own records barely acknowledge his rule existed at all. Trade between Skyrim and Cyrodiil continued largely uninterrupted throughout Okato's administration, according to what commercial records survive from this period. Some historians believe this economic continuity mattered more to northern nobles than questions of who specifically governed from the imperial city. Stable trade meant stable income, and stable income mattered considerably more than the ethnicity of whoever administered the wider empire. A theory suggests Okato understood this practical reality clearly, prioritizing economic stability specifically to avoid provoking unnecessary resistance from distant provinces. This pragmatic approach may explain why northern resentment, if it existed at all, never translated into any serious disruption of trade or open rebellion. Other historians argue trade continuity simply reflected existing infrastructure, rather than any deliberate policy choice made specifically by Okato himself. Whatever the true cause, steady trade likely did more to secure northern loyalty than any political argument ever could have accomplished. Prosperity, in this reading, purchased peace far more effectively than any appeal to shared identity or cultural loyalty. Some scholars believe Okato's elven identity mattered less to ordinary Skyrim citizens than it did to the nobles who wrote most surviving records. Common farmers, traders, and laborers likely cared more about taxes, safety, and harvests than about the ethnicity of a distant administrator. A theory suggests resentment toward elven rule existed mainly among educated nobility, rather than reflecting any broad popular sentiment across Skyrim generally. This would mean Okato's rule caused far less genuine tension than surviving noble correspondence might otherwise suggest to later historians. Ordinary life continued largely undisturbed, regardless of debates happening among Jarls and their advisors in distant halls. Other historians caution against assuming common sentiment matched noble sentiment, given how little direct evidence survives from ordinary citizens themselves. Whatever ordinary Skyrim residents actually felt about elven administration, their voices remain largely absent from the historical record entirely. History, in this case, preserves the opinions of those who wrote, rather than those who simply lived and worked. Okato's fall marked the effective end of centralized imperial authority, ushering in the fractured period that followed the Oblivion Crisis. Skyrim, like much of Tamriel, entered a period of increasing local autonomy once Okato's administration collapsed alongside the wider empire. Some historians believe this shift benefited Skyrim's nobles considerably, freeing them from whatever obligations or arrangements had existed under Okato's rule. A theory suggests this transition happened smoothly, precisely because Okato's administration had already granted meaningful autonomy well before his death occurred. Nobles accustomed to local control found the transition to greater independence less disruptive than it might otherwise have been. Others argue the transition was simply chaotic, with autonomy arriving through collapse rather than through any smooth, planned process. Whatever the true nature of this shift, Skyrim emerged from Okato's era with considerably more independence than it had held previously. That independence would shape Skyrim's political character for generations, long after Okato himself had been mostly forgotten. Few statues, monuments, or lasting tributes to Okato exist anywhere in Skyrim, despite his considerable influence over the wider empire during his rule. Some historians find this absence notable, especially compared to how other significant imperial figures are sometimes commemorated in northern holds. A theory suggests Skyrim's nobles preferred to quietly forget an era of elven administration, rather than commemorate it in any lasting way. This selective forgetting may reflect discomfort, whether cultural, political, or simply a preference for narratives centered on Nordic rather than elven leadership. Other historians argue Okato simply never mattered enough to ordinary Skyrim life to warrant any lasting physical commemoration in the first place. Whatever the reason, his name appears rarely in Skyrim's own historical memory, despite his considerable role in the wider empire's structure. Cyrodiil remembers him as potentate. Skyrim, for the most part, simply moved on, without much comment at all. History remembers rulers differently, depending on where its memory happens to be kept. Okato governed without ever holding the imperial crown himself, a distinction some scholars believe shaped how his authority was ultimately perceived. A ruler without a crown occupies a strange position, holding real power while lacking the symbolic weight a crown traditionally carries. Some believe this lack of formal crowning made his rule feel temporary, provisional, and easier for distant provinces to eventually set aside. This impression of temporariness may explain why his fall generated less lasting disruption than a crowned emperor's death might have caused. Others argue his considerable administrative skill mattered far more than any symbolic crown ever could have, regardless of formal title. Whatever the truth, Okato ruled a human empire as an elf, without a crown, for years that Skyrim mostly let pass quietly. His name faded from northern memory quickly, though the empire he briefly held together continued shaping Tamriel long after he was gone. An elf once ruled without a crown, and in time, even that fact settled quietly into history's longer, slower forgetting. A mortal once built a city that exists outside the rules of the cosmos. No god gave permission. No Daedric prince offered a realm. He simply built one himself. The Clockwork City sits in a place that does not belong to Aetherius or Oblivion. Aetherius is the realm of magic and the divine, where the souls of the faithful eventually travel. Oblivion is the vast collection of Daedric realms, each shaped by the prince who rules it. Every known plane of existence falls into one of these two broad categories, or exists somewhere in the space between them. The Clockwork City, however, was built deliberately outside this entire framework, constructed through mortal ingenuity rather than divine will or Daedric power. Its creator, Sotha Sil, was a mortal who ascended to godhood through the tribunal's use of Kagranak's tools on the heart of Lorcan. Even so, the city itself predates that ascension in design and intention, rooted in mortal ambition rather than divine right. This makes it unique across all of known cosmology, a constructed plane that owes nothing to the established order of the universe. No other structure in recorded history occupies quite the same position in the cosmos as this city of gears and silence. Whether the Clockwork City still functions after Sotha Sil's death remains one of its more persistent, open questions. Sotha Sil designed the city with extraordinary precision, building mechanisms intended to operate indefinitely without constant oversight. A theory holds that the city continues running exactly as designed, its gears turning and its systems cycling without any living hand to guide them. If true, this would mean an entire plane of existence now operates autonomously, answering to no god, no Daedric prince, and no mortal controller. Some scholars find this possibility deeply unusual, since every other known realm has some form of active governing presence. Others believe the city began slowly deteriorating the moment its maker died, its systems gradually losing the precise calibration only Sotha Sil could maintain. Without anyone capable of understanding every mechanism fully, small failures might compound quietly over time into larger breakdowns. Whether the city hums along unchanged or slowly winds towards silence, no one currently alive can easily travel there to find out. What it means that a mortal built something entirely outside the Daedra order deserves careful consideration. The established cosmology of Tamriel positions nearly everything within a framework created and maintained by divine and Daedric powers. Mortals exist within this framework, shaped by it, but generally unable to create anything outside its boundaries. Sothasil's Clockwork City challenges this assumption directly, suggesting mortal ingenuity can exceed the boundaries originally set by cosmic architecture. Some scholars believe this achievement was only possible because Sothasil had already transcended ordinary mortality through the tribunal's apotheosis. Others argue the city's construction demonstrates something more fundamental, that the framework itself has gaps a sufficiently brilliant mind can exploit. This second reading suggests the cosmos is less rigidly defined than most theological traditions assume it to be. If one mortal found a gap in the established order and built an entire city inside it, the order itself may be more flexible than gods and princes prefer to acknowledge. Whether the Clockwork City's mechanisms are decaying or simply changing in unobservable ways presents a genuinely difficult question. Decay requires a reference point, a comparison between what something once was and what it has become over time. Without anyone present who remembers the city at its peak, identifying decay becomes nearly impossible from the outside. A theory suggests the city is not decaying in any traditional sense, but instead adapting, its mechanisms responding to conditions Sothasil anticipated and built responses for. This would mean apparent changes simply reflect the city operating exactly as intended, rather than failing in any meaningful way. Another theory holds that decay is inevitable without active maintenance, with every complex system eventually failing when left without care. A gear city, built by one mind, however extraordinary, cannot account for every possible future condition it might eventually face. Whether adaptation or decay more accurately describes the city's current state, no observer exists close enough to say with any certainty. Reports of strange mechanical objects appearing in the regular world have occasionally been connected to the Clockwork City by certain researchers. Small devices of unknown origin, sometimes featuring materials and construction techniques unlike anything produced in Tamriel, have turned up in scattered locations over the years. A theory suggests these objects somehow leaked or traveled from the Clockwork City into the regular world through gaps in the boundary separating the two. If the city operates an active boundary between itself and the wider cosmos, small failures in that boundary might occasionally allow objects to slip through. This theory remains impossible to confirm, since no recovered object has ever been definitively linked to the Clockwork City through clear evidence. Others argue these unusual devices have entirely mundane explanations, reflecting simply lost or forgotten craftsmanship from known Tamrielic traditions. Whatever their true origin, the occasional appearance of genuinely inexplicable mechanical objects keeps this theory alive among those who study the Clockwork City's possible influence on the wider world. Whether other constructed planes might exist, built by minds unknown to history, follows naturally from the Clockwork City's existence. If one mortal achieved this feat, the possibility that others attempted something similar cannot be easily dismissed. Some scholars believe the Clockwork City represents a genuine discovery, a technique that could theoretically be replicated by anyone sufficiently knowledgeable and determined. Others argue it required a unique combination of factors, specifically Sothasil's particular genius, combined with access to Kagranak's tools, that cannot simply be repeated. A theory holds that other constructed planes may exist in hidden corners of the cosmos, built by minds who never achieved Sothasil's fame or historical visibility. These hypothetical planes might be far smaller, less sophisticated, or simply unknown because their creators left no surviving record. Whether any such planes exist remains entirely speculative, since no evidence points clearly toward any specific example beyond the Clockwork City itself. What the theory does suggest is that the cosmos may contain more constructed spaces than established theology currently acknowledges. Sothasil's relationship with the Clockwork City reflected something deeper than simple construction or engineering ambition. He spent centuries inside it, gradually withdrawing from the wider world as the city consumed more of his attention and energy. Some believe he was trying to perfect a model of existence, a world operating entirely on logic and precision, rather than divine caprice. This goal would explain both the extraordinary detail of the city's construction and his increasing isolation from other gods and mortals alike. A theory suggests the city was never meant only as a home or a project, but as an argument about how reality itself should properly function. In Sothasil's view, a cosmos governed by mechanical precision would be more just than one governed by the unpredictable will of gods and princes. Whether this argument had any merit matters less than the fact that he committed his entire existence to making the case through construction rather than philosophy alone. The city stands as a built argument, still running long after the mind that made it stopped. The materials used in the clockwork city's construction remain partially mysterious, even to scholars who have studied surviving descriptions carefully. Some components appear to use metals and alloys not found naturally anywhere in Tamriel's known regions. A theory suggests Sothasil sourced materials from outside the regular world entirely, pulling resources from Aetherius or other planes through methods he never fully documented. This would explain both the unusual properties of certain city components and why no one has successfully replicated his construction techniques using materials available in the regular world. Others argue Sothasil simply developed advanced alchemical processes for refining ordinary materials into extraordinary ones, without needing any extraplanar sourcing. The distinction matters for understanding whether the city could theoretically be rebuilt or repaired, using materials a skilled modern craftsperson could actually obtain. If extraplanar materials were essential, the city cannot be repaired or replicated without repeating Sothasil's most extraordinary and dangerous feats. Whatever materials built the city, they were chosen with enough care to survive centuries without any confirmed maintenance from any living hand. Some scholars wonder whether the clockwork city has any effect on the flow of time within its boundaries compared to the regular world outside. Constructed planes, existing outside the normal cosmological framework, might not necessarily experience time at the same rate as Tamriel itself. A theory suggests time inside the city runs differently, perhaps slower, meaning centuries of internal time might correspond to far less time passing in the regular world. This would have strange implications for anything or anyone currently inside the city, potentially experiencing a very different timeline from the one Tamriel itself follows. Others argue time consistency is a fundamental feature of reality that no constructed plane, however extraordinary, could meaningfully alter. No reliable testimony from anyone who has spent extended time inside and outside the city exists to confirm or deny this theory clearly. What remains is pure speculation, built on the reasonable observation that a place outside the normal cosmos might not follow all of the normal cosmos's rules. The clockwork city represents something that most established theology in Tamriel struggles to comfortably accommodate. A mortal-built plane, existing outside divine and Daedric authority, challenges fundamental assumptions about how the cosmos is organized and who controls it. Some religious traditions simply ignore the city entirely, preferring not to address what its existence implies about the limits of divine power. Others acknowledge it reluctantly, describing it as a permitted exception rather than a genuine challenge to the established order. A theory holds that the city's very existence is quietly unsettling to divine powers, representing a kind of freedom from cosmic architecture that most mortals never achieve or even attempt. Whether gods find the clockwork city troubling, impressive, or simply irrelevant to their concerns remains impossible to know from any mortal perspective. What seems clear is that the city exists regardless of how any theology chooses to classify or ignore it. It sits outside the known order, gears turning, waiting for a question no one alive quite knows how to properly ask. Some figures in Tamriel's history die clearly, once, with witnesses and a named burial site. This is not one of those figures. The Underking is a name attached to a figure who appears, vanishes, and reappears across several different periods of Tamriel's long history. Each appearance involves a powerful, ancient presence connected to soul magic, politics, and the deep mechanics of death itself. Some scholars treat these appearances as a single continuous figure, one man who somehow persisted across centuries. Others treat them as separate individuals who adopted the same legend deliberately, creating an intentional pattern of return. The name itself carries weight, suggesting a ruler beneath the surface of ordinary history, one who operates outside the visible structures of empire or kingdom. Whatever the true nature of this figure, the pattern of return and disappearance is real enough that serious historians cannot simply dismiss it as coincidence or folk legend. Something returns, again and again, wearing the same name, if not necessarily the same face. Whether the Underking represents a single person living far beyond any normal lifespan remains the central unresolved question around this figure. Some scholars point to consistent details appearing across different accounts, separated by centuries, suggesting genuine personal continuity rather than simple legend adoption. The connection to Wulfharth, an ancient Nord figure of enormous power, provides one possible anchor for understanding how this continuity might function. Wulfharth himself was said to have been resurrected multiple times, his soul refusing ordinary death in ways scholars still struggle to fully explain. If the Underking represents Wulfharth's continued existence across different ages, this suggests a soul powerful enough to persist and return without the usual mechanisms of conventional resurrection. Some believe this persistence reflects a specific manipulation of soul magic, allowing the figure to avoid the soul cairn or Aetherius entirely. Whether one man truly lived across all these centuries, or whether the explanation requires something stranger, remains genuinely open. A rival theory suggests the Underking is not one person, but several, each deliberately adopting the legend to claim its accumulated power and authority. A figure who has already returned from death multiple times carries a kind of authority that no ordinary ruler can easily match or challenge. Claiming to be the Underking, or to embody the same principle, would grant a powerful political and psychological advantage over enemies and followers alike. Some historians believe at least two distinct individuals adopted the Underking identity at different points in history, each building on what the previous one had established. This theory requires the legend itself to have been well known enough to be worth adopting, suggesting the Underking's reputation spread broadly enough to function as a usable political identity. Whether the adoption was cynical or sincere, with later figures genuinely believing themselves to be continuations of the original, remains impossible to determine. A legend powerful enough to be worth wearing may eventually become indistinguishable from the thing it originally described. What the Underking's repeated disappearances and returns suggest about death itself in Tamriel deserves careful consideration. Death in Tamriel operates through established systems, souls traveling to the soul cairn, to Aetherius, or to specific Daedric realms depending on circumstances. A figure who returns repeatedly from death implies either an exception to these systems or a way of operating outside them entirely. Some scholars believe the Underking found a way to anchor his soul to something in the regular world, preventing it from traveling anywhere after physical death. This anchor, whatever its nature, would allow the soul to eventually reform a physical presence, rather than remaining permanently departed. Others believe the returns reflect resurrection through external magical intervention, rather than any inherent property of the Underking's soul itself. Whatever mechanism allows these returns, it operates outside what most scholars understand about death's normal processes in Tamriel. Every version of the Underking's story ends in disappearance, rather than confirmed death, which some historians find deeply significant. A figure who dies clearly, with witnesses and a burial site, stops generating mystery relatively quickly. A figure who simply vanishes leaves a permanent opening, the possibility of eventual return that no confirmed death can close. Some scholars believe these disappearances were deliberately engineered, the Underking choosing to vanish rather than die, in order to preserve the legend's power. Disappearance is ambiguous in a way death rarely is, making it a more useful ending for a figure whose power depends partly on the possibility of future return. Others argue the disappearances reflect genuine mystery, rather than deliberate strategy, with even those closest to the Underking unable to explain what actually happened. Whether strategic or mysterious, every disappearance followed the same basic pattern, leaving no body, no clear explanation, and no final answer. This consistency across multiple separate accounts suggests something more than coincidence, shapes how this figure's stories always tend to end. Whether prophecy itself plays a role in pulling the Underking back into the world, represents one of the more complex theories attached to this figure. Elder Scrolls prophecy in Tamriel functions less like simple prediction and more like a force that bends reality toward particular outcomes over time. Some scholars believe the Underking exists as a prophetic figure, one whose returns are not merely possible, but cosmologically necessary at specific moments in history. In this reading, prophecy does not predict his returns, so much as require them, ensuring the figure reappears when some larger historical pattern demands it. This theory would explain the uncanny timing of each return, appearing specifically during periods of maximum historical significance, rather than at random. Others argue this reading attributes too much structure to what might simply be coincidence and motivated storytelling by those who wanted to see patterns. Whether prophecy drives the returns, or simply gets credited with them afterward, remains genuinely difficult to determine from existing evidence. The Elder Scrolls themselves, if they address the Underking specifically, have never been fully interpreted by any scholar whose conclusions survive intact. Some scholars believe Wulfharth and the Underking were genuinely the same figure through multiple periods, rather than simply related legends. Wulfharth was born, died, was resurrected, died again, and by some accounts was resurrected a third time across different historical eras. The mechanisms behind these resurrections differ across accounts, involving Shaw's intervention, soul anchoring, or manipulation of circumstances that most scholars cannot fully reconstruct. A theory suggests each resurrection left Wulfharth slightly different, not simply restored but altered by the process of returning from wherever his soul had traveled. This accumulated alteration might explain why accounts from different periods describe the same essential figure behaving in noticeably different ways. Identity, in this reading, survives death but does not emerge unchanged from it. Whether this altered continuity makes the Underking genuinely the same person across centuries depends on how strictly one defines personal identity beyond physical existence. The political implications of the Underking's existence troubled several different imperial administrations across Tamriel's history. A figure claiming continuity across centuries and demonstrating knowledge and power consistent with that claim represents a challenge to any ruler whose legitimacy rests on conventional succession. Some historians believe certain imperial records deliberately downplayed the Underking's appearances, treating them as regional legend rather than historically significant events. This downplaying would serve obvious political purposes, since acknowledging an ancient, death-resistant figure with his own claims to authority could destabilize any existing power structure. A theory holds that official histories from several different periods contain deliberate gaps around exactly those moments when the Underking is believed to have been most active. If true, recovering a complete picture of his actual historical role would require reading around official silence rather than simply through available documentation. History shaped by political necessity leaves its own distinctive kind of gap, one shaped more by what was avoided than by what was lost through ordinary accident. Some accounts describe the Underking as possessing knowledge that should have been impossible for any single person to retain across such long gaps in time. Details about ancient events, specific locations of buried objects, and personal knowledge of figures dead for centuries all appear in various accounts as evidence of genuine continuous memory. Some scholars believe this knowledge reflects real personal memory, the strongest argument for the Underking being genuinely one continuous figure, rather than several. Others argue this knowledge could have been acquired through other means, through Elder Scrolls consultation, Daedric assistance, or simply through careful study of records no longer available to ordinary scholars. A figure who knows things no living person should know may have lived through them, or may simply have found ways to learn about them that bypass normal historical channels entirely. Whatever the source of this knowledge, it consistently appears across accounts as one of the Underking's most unsettling and persuasive attributes. The Underking's connection to the heart of Lorcan adds another layer of complexity to theories about his nature and persistence. Some accounts link his unusual resistance to death directly to manipulation of the heart, suggesting his soul was anchored to it in ways that prevented normal departure after physical death. If true, this would explain both the mechanism of his returns and why those returns eventually ceased once circumstances around the heart itself changed. Others argue this connection is symbolic rather than mechanical, describing the Underking as a figure shaped by the heart's influence rather than physically tethered to it. This distinction matters considerably for understanding what his disappearances actually represent in practical terms. A soul tethered to the heart would have no clear path forward once that tether was severed, potentially explaining why some accounts suggest the Underking finally rested rather than simply vanished again. Whether rest or simply another disappear awaits his next potential return, no account offers any final confirmation either way. The Underking keeps appearing in Tamriel's history at moments when something genuinely important was at stake. He never appears during quiet decades or unremarkable reigns. His timing, whether prophetically driven or simply historically convenient, always places him at the edge of genuinely significant change. Long after this chapter closes, Tamriel's historians will likely keep arguing about whether one man or many wore that name across the ages. The stones where he vanished give no answer. Neither do the eras that remember his return. Before the blades carried their distinctive curved swords through the halls of Cloud Ruler Temple, another order hunted dragons with methods history mostly forgot to preserve. The Akaviri Dragon Guard arrived in Tamriel long before the organization most people associate with dragon hunting took its familiar shape. These warriors came from Akavir, a continent east of Tamriel, specifically hunting dragons and dragon-blooded individuals as their founding purpose. Their earliest methods, developed and refined in Akavir before their arrival, would have reflected training traditions entirely separate from anything native to Tamriel. Some historians believe these original methods were more direct and aggressive than what later successor organizations eventually practiced. A theory suggests the early Dragon Guard used techniques specifically designed for Akaviri dragon biology, which may have differed in important ways from the dragons found in Tamriel. When they arrived and encountered Tamrielic dragons, adaptations would have been necessary, but the original Akaviri foundation likely persisted for some time beneath those adaptations. Whatever specific techniques they employed, almost none of them survived in documented form into later periods. The methods that killed dragons in Akavir are now as lost as the continent itself feels to most Tamrielic scholars. Some historians believe the original Dragon Guard carried weapons specifically designed and enchanted for fighting dragons, rather than ordinary opponents. These weapons would have reflected deep Akaviri metallurgical and enchanting traditions, producing blades capable of penetrating dragon scale more effectively than conventional weaponry. A theory holds that certain of these weapons were buried in the eastern mountains of Skyrim, left by Dragon Guard members who died, retired, or simply chose to cache their equipment in remote locations. The Jural Mountains and the Velothi Range, sitting along Skyrim's eastern and southern borders, contain numerous unexplored caves and ancient ruins where such weapons might plausibly rest undiscovered. Some treasure hunters have specifically searched these ranges for Akaviri artifacts over the years, with limited and inconsistent success. Whether any original Dragon Guard weapons survive intact after so many centuries of burial remains genuinely uncertain. Metal corrodes, enchantments fade, and wooden components decay, regardless of how carefully an object was originally made. If any originals survive, they would represent one of the oldest surviving examples of specifically anti-dragon technology in all of Tamriel. Why the original Dragon Guard's specific techniques were not passed down to successor organizations remains a genuinely puzzling historical question. Knowledge of such practical value specifically how to fight and kill dragons effectively, would normally be preserved carefully by any organization with reason to need it. Some historians believe the transition from the original Dragon Guard to successor organizations involved deliberate restructuring, with new leadership choosing to develop fresh approaches rather than inherit old ones. Others suggest the techniques were considered too specifically Akaviri to translate meaningfully into organizations, drawing primarily from Tamrielic personnel and traditions. A theory holds that some techniques were simply too dangerous to practice without access to living dragons, and as dragons became rarer, the knowledge gradually became untestable and therefore untransmittable. Skills that cannot be practiced against real opponents tend to decay within a single generation, regardless of how carefully they are written down. Whether deliberate choice or gradual attrition eliminated these methods, the result was the same. Successor organizations developed largely from scratch, rather than inheriting a complete fighting tradition. Whether the Dragon Guard's eventual disbandment was voluntary or politically forced remains one of the more contested questions about this organization's history. Some historians believe the order dissolved naturally once its primary purpose, hunting dragons, became unnecessary during a long period of dragon dormancy. An organization built around a specific threat may simply fade when that threat disappears from daily relevance. Others believe political pressure from various imperial administrations played a decisive role, with powerful rulers finding a semi-independent military order inconvenient, regardless of its stated purpose. A theory holds that the transition to successor organizations was not entirely voluntary, with specific political decisions forcing the original Dragon Guard's leadership to accept restructuring as the price of survival. Whether the leaders who accepted such restructuring believed they were preserving something essential or simply accommodating unavoidable pressure remains impossible to determine from existing records. The records themselves, where they survive, tend to describe transitions in administrative rather than political terms, obscuring whatever conflict or negotiation may actually have occurred. Some scholars believe a hidden shrine to the original Dragon Guard's founder exists somewhere in Skyrim's eastern mountains, undiscovered and largely forgotten. Organizations with deep traditions often create commemorative spaces, shrines or memorials, to honor their founding figures, particularly when those figures died in ways that invited reverence. The original Dragon Guard's founder, whoever specifically held that role, would have been an appropriate subject for such a memorial. A theory suggests this shrine was deliberately hidden during a period of political pressure, removed from visibility to protect it from authorities who might have wished to erase or repurpose it. Hidden shrines, once their location is forgotten by the people who hid them, can remain concealed for extraordinary lengths of time. The Velothi Mountains particularly offer a landscape of deep caves, isolated valleys, and ancient ruins, where a modest shrine could rest entirely undisturbed for centuries. Whether such a shrine ever existed, and whether it still survives if it did, remains completely unconfirmed by any reliable record. What persists is only the reasonable historical observation that organizations like the Dragon Guard tend to leave memorial traces somewhere. Akaviri culture itself remains poorly understood by most Tamrielic scholars, which complicates any attempt to reconstruct what the original Dragon Guard's practices actually looked like. Most knowledge of Akavir comes through filtered sources, accounts written by Tamrielic observers rather than Akaviri voices directly. These filtered accounts tend to emphasize what seemed unusual or striking to Tamrielic eyes, rather than providing systematic understanding of Akaviri traditions. A theory suggests the original Dragon Guard's practices contained elements that Tamrielic successor organizations found genuinely incomprehensible, making direct transmission impossible, even when it was attempted. Rituals, mental disciplines, or physical training methods that make sense within one cultural framework may become meaningless or dangerous when transplanted without the surrounding context. If the original Dragon Guard practiced techniques rooted in distinctly Akaviri ways of understanding dragons and combat, Those techniques may have been fundamentally untranslatable into Tamrielic tradition, regardless of anyone's intentions or effort. Some accounts describe the original Dragon Guard members as having survived direct contact with dragonfire more effectively than ordinary soldiers should have been able to manage. Whether this reflected specialized armor, specific magical protections, or techniques for avoiding fire exposure entirely remains unclear from surviving descriptions. A theory suggests the Dragon Guard developed armor using materials specifically resistant to dragon fire, sourced from Akavir, or produced through metallurgical processes no longer known in Tamriel. If such armor once existed, and was buried alongside weapons in remote eastern locations, it might still retain some of its original properties, if the burial conditions prevented complete deterioration. Others argue the accounts of unusual fire resistance reflect simple storytelling exaggeration, rather than any genuine material or magical advantage. Either way, fighting dragons requires solving the problem of their fire breath, and any organization serious about the task would necessarily have developed some systematic response to it. The transition from the original Dragon Guard to the organization eventually known as the Blades involved changes in purpose, culture, and personnel that gradually transformed the institution's essential character. Some historians describe this transition as a slow drift rather than any single decisive event, with each generation inheriting a slightly different organization from the previous one. A theory suggests the Blades, that most people recognize from later Tamrielic history, would have been nearly unrecognizable to the original Dragon Guard members who first arrived from Akavir. If true, calling the Blades a successor organization understates how thoroughly the institution transformed over those centuries of gradual change. The name, the swords, and certain ceremonial elements survived the transition, but whether anything essential about the original Dragon Guard's purpose or practice survived alongside them remains genuinely debatable. Organizations tend to preserve their symbols long after their original substance has drifted into something entirely different. Whether any original Dragon Guard traditions survived in hidden or informal ways, passed down outside official successor organizations, represents an intriguing possibility. Small groups sometimes preserve older practices informally when official channels abandon them, maintaining knowledge through personal transmission rather than institutional structure. A theory holds that individual Dragon Guard survivors, unwilling to accept the restructuring forced on their organization, maintained original practices privately across several generations. Such private preservation would leave almost no formal record, existing only in unpublished personal documents, oral tradition, or physical artifacts held by descendant families. Whether any such informal preservation actually occurred, and whether anything it preserved still exists in recognizable form today, remains entirely speculative. What seems historically plausible is that at least some individuals found the original Dragon Guard's dissolution sufficiently important to resist, rather than simply accepting the transition without any attempt at preservation. Skyrim's eastern holds contain ruins and locations that some researchers connect specifically to the original Dragon Guard's presence and activity in the region. Certain patrol routes, camp locations, and fortified positions make strategic sense specifically for an organization watching the eastern mountains for dragon activity. A theory suggests some of these positions were established during the original Dragon Guard's active period, predating the more commonly known Blades installations in the same general region. If original Dragon Guard positions exist beneath or alongside later Blade structures, archaeological investigation of these sites might reveal two distinct layers of activity, separated by centuries. Whether such investigation has ever been conducted systematically, and whether any findings from it have been published, remains unclear from available scholarly records. The mountains keep their own records in stone and soil, whatever written history chose to preserve or overlook about the organization that once watched them. The original Dragon Guard came from across the world's edge, carrying knowledge of dragons that no one in Tamriel had independently developed. That knowledge, however specific or strange it might have seemed, represented centuries of hard-won experience from a continent where dragons were apparently far more present and dangerous than in Tamriel itself. Most of it is now gone. The weapons may be buried somewhere in cold mountain rock. The shrine may be sitting quietly in an unmarked cave, and the techniques may exist only in fragments no one has yet recognized for what they are. The organization that replaced them built something functional and lasting, but something from that original crossing, that first arrival with Akaviri blades and Akaviri purpose, did not survive the transition into what came after. Most Daedric realms have a fixed shape. Cold Harbor stays cold. The Deadlands stay burning. Sheogorath's realm does not stay anything for very long. The Shivering Isles, the realm governed by Sheogorath, Prince of Madness, is unlike every other known Daedric plane in one fundamental way. Other realms reflect the fixed nature of their ruling prince, shaped by a single consistent will and maintained in a stable form across centuries. The Shivering Isles changes. Its geography shifts. Its internal rules bend and reform, and visitors across different accounts describe experiences that sometimes contradict each other in significant ways. Some scholars treat these contradictions as evidence of unreliable narration, since witnesses emerging from a madness realm carry obvious credibility problems. Others believe the contradictions are real, reflecting a plane that genuinely does not maintain a consistent shape across different visits or different visitors. Whatever the truth, the Shivering Isles occupies a unique position among known Daedric realms, being the only one whose appearance is routinely described differently by different sources, without any obvious explanation for the discrepancy. One of the more persistent theories about the Shivering Isles holds that the realm does not have a fixed form at all, but instead reflects the mind of whoever is currently experiencing it. In this theory, the realm functions less like a place and more like a mirror, presenting each visitor with a landscape shaped partly or entirely by their own interior world. A scholar entering the realm might encounter libraries and towers. A warrior might find battlefields and broken fortresses. A farmer fleeing grief might find their own home, wrong in ways they cannot immediately name. Some scholars find this theory compelling because it would explain the contradictory accounts without requiring any of the witnesses to be simply lying. Others argue this reading gives too much agency to the visitor, since Daedric realms are generally understood to be shaped by their ruler rather than their guests. Whether the realm reflects Sheogorath's nature, the visitor's nature, or some combination of both, remains one of the more genuinely open questions about how this particular plane operates. Madness as a concept sits uncomfortably between punishment and mercy in most philosophical traditions that bother to examine it carefully. Ordinary thinking treats madness as something imposed, a loss inflicted on a person against their will. Yet some traditions in Tamriel, particularly among certain isolated communities, describe madness as something closer to relief, a mind finally released from the burden of having to make sense of everything it encounters. Sheogorath's realm, in this second reading, is not a place of suffering, but a place where the relentless pressure of ordered thinking finally stops. A theory holds that for certain minds, particularly those already fracturing under weight they cannot carry, the Shivering Isles represent something genuinely appealing rather than something to be feared. This does not mean the realm is kind or gentle in any conventional sense. It means the realm offers something ordinary reality does not, a complete suspension of the demand to be coherent. Whether this counts as mercy depends entirely on what kind of mind is doing the counting. Some would find endless ordered silence far more punishing than anything Sheogorath's shifting halls could offer. Skyrim's folk traditions contain numerous stories about places where ordinary rules stop applying, where travelers become lost in ways that seem impossible given how short a distance they walked. These stories almost never name Sheogorath directly. They describe instead a strange wood, an unmarked valley, or a cave that opens into more rooms than the mountain above it could possibly contain. Some scholars believe these stories preserve genuine folk memory of minor Daedric influence, moments when the boundary between Skyrim and the Shivering Isles thinned enough to affect local geography in small, disorienting ways. Others argue the stories reflect simple human psychology, the universal tendency to give supernatural explanations to experiences that are actually mundane. What makes the Sheogorath connection more plausible than coincidence is the specific character of these stories. The confusion described is never violent or dark in typical Daedric fashion. It is instead absurd, gentle, and deeply strange in ways that match the Shivering Isles' specific character, rather than that of any other Daedric prince's influence. Travelers emerge confused but not harmed, unable to explain what they experienced, which sounds considerably more like Sheogorath's particular flavor of interference than anyone else's. Certain remote villages in Skyrim have developed superstitions that mirror the internal logic of the Shivering Isles, with a precision that seems too specific to be coincidental. A village near the Reach follows a tradition of never completing any building before moving into it, living always in a state of deliberate incompleteness. Another community maintains a practice of naming children twice, once at birth and once after their first serious illness, treating the second name as the more real of the two. These practices make a certain kind of internal sense within their own communities, passed down across generations without any explanation for their origin that anyone living can still provide. A theory holds that these traditions began during some ancient period of Daedric influence, when Sheogorath's proximity to their region was strong enough to leave lasting impressions on local custom. Whether the original community members understood what was happening to them, or simply adapted to strange circumstances without theological framework to explain it, remains impossible to know. What persists is only the tradition itself, stripped of its original context, maintained now through habit rather than any remembered reason. Some scholars raise the genuinely difficult question of whether Sheogorath himself maintains a stable identity, or whether even he changes shape over time, in ways that complicate treating him as a consistent figure. The mythology around Sheogorath contains a detail that most Daedric theology finds deeply unusual, namely that Sheogorath was once Jigalag, the Prince of Order, transformed into the Prince of Madness as punishment by the other princes. This transformation raises a serious question about what Sheogorath actually is. Is he a stable Daedric prince who governs madness, or is he the consequence of a punishment imposed on another prince, meaning his very existence reflects an enforced transformation rather than any natural identity? Some scholars believe this origin story means Sheogorath is fundamentally unstable in ways other princes are not, his identity resting on a foundation that was broken before it was built. Others argue he has had sufficient time to become genuinely himself, the original Jigalag identity fully subsumed into something new. Whether Sheogorath experiences himself as continuous, or whether even he cannot fully track who he is across the centuries, remains as unanswerable as most questions about Daedric inner life. The question of what actually happens to a mortal mind that spends extended time in the Shivering Isles deserves careful attention beyond simple descriptions of madness. Some accounts describe visitors emerging with fragmented memories, unable to reconstruct a coherent timeline of what they experienced inside. Others describe a strange clarity, a sense that the confusion they felt inside the realm was actually a form of perception rather than its opposite. A theory holds that the Shivering Isles does not destroy ordered thinking so much as temporarily replace it with a different kind of thinking, one that processes experience through entirely different categories. Mortals who return often struggle to translate what they understood inside into terms their ordinary minds can use outside. This translation problem might explain why accounts of the realm differ so dramatically, not because visitors are lying, but because they are each translating the same untranslatable experience into different available vocabularies. Whether this different kind of thinking constitutes madness in any meaningful clinical sense, or simply reflects an encounter with a genuinely different logic system, remains a question ordinary frameworks cannot easily resolve. Sheogorath's relationship to creativity and artistic production appears more frequently in obscure scholarly texts than in mainstream theological discussions. Some scholars note that artists, poets, and musicians who claim to have been touched by Sheogorath's influence often produce work of unusual quality alongside work of complete incoherence, sometimes in the same sitting. A theory holds that Sheogorath's realm is somehow connected to the space where creative insight actually happens, the mental state that sits just outside ordinary ordered thinking, where unexpected connections become visible. In this reading, madness and genius borrow from the same underlying source, which would explain why the two so often appear together in the same person across history. This does not romanticize madness or suggest it is desirable in any practical sense. It simply observes that ordered thinking has genuine limitations, and that something residing just outside it occasionally produces results ordered thinking cannot. Whether Sheogorath engineered this connection deliberately, or whether it reflects something structural about how mortal minds relate to his domain, most texts do not venture to say. Folk healers in certain isolated Skyrim communities maintain practices that scholars of Daedric theology find unusually similar to described rituals from the Shivering Isles. Treatments for grief, mental collapse, and what these communities call a broken mind involve specific combinations of plants, spoken phrases, and deliberate exposure to disorienting sensory experience. Some of these plants grow primarily in locations where Daedric influence is known to have historically been active. A theory holds that these folk healing traditions preserve genuine knowledge passed down from communities that once had meaningful contact with Sheogorath's influence on their region. Whether that contact was direct or ambient, through proximity to a thinned boundary, rather than deliberate worship or summoning, the knowledge seems to have produced practical techniques that communities found worth preserving. Other scholars argue the similarity between these practices and Shivering Isles ritual is superficial rather than structural, reflecting independent development of similar ideas rather than any real historical connection. Whatever the origin, these isolated folk traditions treat the concept of madness with considerably more nuance than mainstream Skyrim culture tends to allow, neither fearing it simply nor embracing it carelessly. The Shivering Isles contains two distinct regions, mania and dementia, representing two different expressions of madness that exist in permanent tension with each other. Mania reflects the expansive, creative, euphoric dimension of madness, full of color and excess and impossible ambition. Dementia reflects the dark, paranoid, collapsing dimension, full of shadows and unshakable dread and quiet dissolution. Some scholars believe this division reveals something true about the nature of madness itself, rather than simply reflecting Sheogorath's aesthetic preferences. Madness in mortal experience does often move between these two states, periods of extraordinary intensity and clarity, alternating with periods of darkness and incoherence. A theory holds that Sheogorath built his realm to reflect a genuine structure in mortal psychology, making the Shivering Isles less of a fantasy and more of a map. Whether this map is accurate, and whether Sheogorath understood he was making one, adds another layer to the question of how much this prince understands his own domain. A ruler who governs madness from within it may not be best positioned to explain the landscape clearly to those outside looking carefully in. The Shivering Isles does not announce itself. It waits, shifts, and admits whoever arrives through means most cannot explain afterward. Long after this chapter settles into silence, certain remote Skyrim villages will still be naming their children twice, still building houses they never quite finish, still warning travelers away from particular valleys where the light sits wrong in the afternoon. Sheogorath needs no temple and no formal prayer. His influence moves through the cracks in ordinary thinking, quiet and patient, waiting for the moment a mind loosens enough to let something genuinely strange pass through. Most people who know anything about Oblivion Gates remember the crisis that ended the Septim Line. Fewer know that something similar, quieter, and less documented happened before. The Oblivion crisis of the Third Era is the one most people remember. Gates opened across Tamriel, cities burned, and the world came closer to ending than it had in a very long time. But certain scholars who study Daedric intervention across longer historical periods have identified references to an earlier event, smaller in scale, but structurally similar, occurring during the chaotic stretch of years known as the Interregnum. This earlier event appears in enough scattered sources to resist dismissal as pure legend, though it never receives the sustained attention that the better documented crisis earns. A theory holds that Oblivion gates open during this period, in limited numbers, concentrated near specific weak points in the boundary between Tamriel and Oblivion, rather than spreading across the entire continent. Whether this represents a genuine rehearsal for the later crisis, a deliberate test of defenses, or simply an opportunistic exploitation of political chaos, remains entirely unresolved. What survives is only enough evidence to suggest something happened, without nearly enough to reconstruct exactly what that something was. How close this earlier crisis came to overwhelming the affected regions entirely is impossible to determine with precision from surviving records. The interregnum was a period of such severe political dysfunction that record-keeping across much of Tamriel fell into disarray. What documentation exists tends to focus on political succession, military conflict, and administrative collapse, rather than supernatural events occurring at the empire's fringes. A theory suggests this earlier gate crisis came considerably closer to disaster than surviving accounts imply, with entire small communities abandoned and never resettled as a direct consequence. Ruins in certain locations near Skyrim's southern border show signs of rapid abandonment rather than gradual decline, with objects left in place as though residents departed in significant haste. Whether this abandonment reflects Daedric Gate activity specifically, or simply the general violence and instability of the interregnum period, remains genuinely unclear from available evidence. The absence of any official account describing a successful response to the crisis is itself suggestive, since successful responses tend to generate proud documentation, while chaotic near failures tend to get quietly buried. A theory holds that a small group of mages, working without any official organizational support, played a significant role in sealing gates near Skyrim's southern border during this earlier crisis. This group appears in no official record by name, organization, or specific membership. They surface only in oblique references within two partially surviving texts, described vaguely as scholars who traveled toward the disturbance rather than away from it. Some historians believe these mages were members of a precursor organization to later formal mage institutions, operating during a period when no established structure existed to coordinate magical response to large-scale Daedric incursion. Others believe they were simply individuals, connected by personal relationship or shared scholarly interest, rather than any formal organizational bond. A group small enough to leave no official record could still accomplish significant practical work, particularly if what they accomplished was sealing rather than fighting, a task that leaves far less visible evidence of having occurred than a military engagement would. Whether their methods resembled later established techniques for closing Oblivion gates, or represented something entirely different developed under severe time pressure, no surviving text explains. Why this earlier crisis left almost no trace in official historical records requires some explanation beyond simple record loss. Political chaos during the interregnum does account for significant gaps in documentation across many topics, but the specific absence of this event, even in later histories written once political stability returned, suggests something more deliberate than ordinary record attrition. A theory holds that whoever eventually consolidated power during the interregnum found detailed accounts of Oblivion Gate activity inconvenient, since such accounts raised uncomfortable questions about how the boundary between Tamriel and Oblivion had been allowed to weaken enough for gates to open. Weakness of this kind implies failure of protection, which implies failure of governance, which implies fault that any consolidating ruler would prefer not to have associated with the recent past they were inheriting. Deliberately downplaying or simply not encouraging documentation of the event would have been straightforward during a period when most surviving records depended on official patronage. What was not worth recording officially often simply did not get recorded, leaving only fragments in private correspondence and personal journals, most of which did not survive the interregnum's considerable violence. Whether any physical evidence of this earlier gate crisis remains in Skyrim's landscape today represents one of the more intriguing aspects of the theory. Oblivion gates, when they open and operate for any significant period, do leave traces on the landscape around them. The ground in close proximity tends to develop unusual characteristics. Soil composition changes, plant life either dies or mutates, and certain kinds of stone show distinctive stress patterns, consistent with reality, having been mechanically stressed from the other side. A theory suggests specific locations in the hills near Falkreath and the southern reach show exactly these kinds of anomalies, clustered in patterns consistent with former gate activity rather than any known geological process. Some of these anomalous areas have been noted by farmers and hunters who simply describe them as places where crops will not grow properly or where animals behave oddly without obvious cause. Whether a systematic geological and magical survey of these areas has ever been conducted, and whether any such survey's findings were published in accessible form, remains unclear from available scholarly records. The landscape, if this theory holds, has been carrying physical memory of this event for centuries longer than any written account has been willing to do. Whether the pattern of an earlier, smaller Oblivion Gate crisis might offer useful information for predicting or preparing for future ones depends significantly on what actually caused the earlier event. If gates opened during the interregnum because political chaos weakened the mechanisms of protection normally maintained by functioning imperial administration, this suggests a causal relationship between political stability and Daedric boundary integrity. In this reading, any future period of sustained political dysfunction might be expected to produce similar vulnerability, making the earlier crisis a genuinely useful historical warning. A theory holds that certain Daedric powers actively monitor mortal political stability, waiting for periods of weakness before attempting boundary penetration that would fail against a more organized defense. This would make the earlier crisis not an accident of chaos, but a deliberate exploitation of opportunity, which has quite different implications for prevention. Others argue the relationship between political stability and Daedric boundary integrity is indirect at best, with gate openings resulting from specific ritual activity rather than passive structural weakness. Whether the earlier crisis teaches anything practically useful depends on which of these competing explanations turns out to be correct. Some scholars who study Daedric incursion patterns believe the interregnum crisis revealed specific geographic vulnerabilities in Skyrim's southern boundary that were never fully addressed afterward. A theory holds that the locations where gates opened during this earlier crisis were not random, but reflected genuine structural weaknesses in the boundary between Tamriel and Oblivion at specific points. These weaknesses might reflect old wound sites from previous Daedric activity, locations where the boundary had been stressed before and never fully repaired. If the same geographic vulnerabilities existed during both the earlier crisis and the better documented later one, this would suggest a map of chronic weak points that have remained consistently exploitable across centuries. Whether any such map has been compiled by scholars with access to both sets of location data remains unknown from public records. The practical implications of such a map, if it existed, would be considerable, offering a predictive tool for identifying where future gate activity might concentrate before it actually begins. Local memory in villages near Skyrim's southern border preserves fragments of what may be genuine historical memory from this earlier crisis, though extracting reliable information from folk tradition requires considerable interpretive caution. Some communities near Falkreath maintain traditions about a period their ancestors called the burning season, described not as a summer of ordinary wildfire, but as a time when the sky itself seemed wrong at the horizon in specific directions. Travelers from that period allegedly refused to approach certain locations that had previously been ordinary and unremarkable parts of the local landscape. A theory suggests these folk memories, however distorted by retelling, preserve genuine recollection of Oblivion Gate activity seen from a distance by communities who survived by staying away rather than approaching. Such distant observation would explain both the survival of these memories and their vagueness, since observers who kept a safe distance would have incomplete and partially obscured perceptions of what they were actually seeing. Whether any community elder tradition in the region preserves more specific detail remains the kind of question that requires patient local fieldwork rather than distant archival research. The mages theorized to have sealed gates near Skyrim's border during this crisis would have worked without the benefit of established technique, institutional support, or any precedent for what they were attempting. Later gate-closing methods, developed in response to the better documented crisis, drew on accumulated knowledge, coordinated effort, and the specific intervention of a septim heir. None of those resources existed during the interregnum. A theory holds that the methods these anonymous mages used were necessarily improvised, developed under pressure from first principles rather than inherited practice. Improvised techniques, developed under extreme conditions, often contain insights that more formally developed methods miss, since necessity forces creative problem-solving that comfortable institutional research rarely produces. Whether any record of their improvised methods survived, preserved by the mages themselves or by witnesses who understood what they were watching, would be an extraordinary historical find. Most scholars who take this theory seriously assume no such record exists, which is precisely what makes the theory so persistently interesting rather than simply settled. The interregnum was already one of the most difficult periods in Tamriel's recorded history, a stretch of decades defined by political violence, institutional collapse, and widespread suffering across the continent. An Oblivion Gate crisis occurring during this same period would have compounded existing misery in ways difficult to fully imagine from a stable historical distance. Communities already dealing with war, famine, and administrative collapse would have had almost no capacity to respond effectively to large-scale Daedric incursion. A theory suggests mortality from this period was significantly higher than official records indicate, with Daedric activity accounting for disappearances and deaths attributed in surviving documents to more politically explicable causes. Whether this theory holds, and whether the true scale of this earlier crisis will ever be properly recoverable from available evidence, remains genuinely uncertain. What seems historically clear is that the interregnum's suffering was deeper and more varied than the records most people have access to manage to convey. The gates that opened during the interregnum, if this theory is correct, eventually closed. The crisis passed without ending everything, the way the better documented crisis also eventually passed. Something stopped it, whether a small group of unnamed mages, the natural closure of gates whose energy was exhausted, or some other mechanism the historical record does not preserve. Skyrim's southern holds continued, scarred in ways the landscape may still remember, in its soil and stone, even when its people have long forgotten why certain fields grow wrong and certain hills feel unwelcoming after dark. The world kept turning, and the gates became a story no one official chose to properly tell. Every map of Skyrim shows the same roads. The roads that moved skooma across the holds for nearly a century are not on any of them. Skooma is a substance refined from moon sugar, itself produced primarily and elsewhere by the Khajiit people, who have cultivated and used it across their long history. In Skyrim, skooma sits firmly in the category of controlled and illegal substances, its trade suppressed by hold law, with varying levels of actual effectiveness across different regions. What most official histories fail to acknowledge clearly is how early the skooma trade established itself in Skyrim, and how thoroughly it became embedded in the territory's economic geography before any authority noticed or chose to act decisively. A theory holds that organized skooma distribution operated in Skyrim for close to a century before any hold administration mounted a response serious enough to produce meaningful disruption. Whether this reflects genuine ignorance on the part of hold authorities, deliberate complicity, or simply the enormous practical difficulty of suppressing a trade conducted through the mountains on unmarked paths, remains a matter of ongoing historical debate. Who the earliest skooma traders in Skyrim actually were remains one of the more genuinely obscure questions about this trade's early history. Some historians believe the original network was established primarily by Khajiit traders, who traveled with caravans, and identified opportunity in the northern market before any organized distribution system existed. Others believe the earliest network was established by human intermediaries, either Cyrodiilic merchants who recognized a profitable northern extension of an existing southern trade, or Skyrim natives who traveled south, made connections, and brought the trade home with them. A theory holds that certain names associated with the trade's early period were deliberately removed from records during a later period of aggressive suppression, when connecting specific families or organizations to the trade's origins became legally and socially dangerous. The removal of names from records is a specific kind of historical damage, harder to detect than simple record loss, because it leaves behind documents that appear complete while actually concealing deliberate gaps. Whether any of these original names survive in private family documents, personal correspondence, or local oral tradition remains the kind of question archival research alone cannot answer. Some hold guards during the trade's earlier period were paid to look in other directions when skooma moved through their territory. This theory does not require wholesale corruption of entire hold guard organizations, only the targeted payment of specific individuals stationed at specific checkpoints that mattered most to established smuggling routes. A relatively small number of well-placed corrupt guards could enable a significant volume of trade to move through an area without meaningful interference. Some historians point to unusual patterns in guard assignment records from certain holds, where specific individuals served extended rotations at particular posts, without the typical rotation that would expose different guards to the same territory over time. Fixed assignment to a specific post creates both opportunity and incentive for local corruption, in ways that regular rotation largely prevents. Whether these assignment patterns reflect deliberate arrangement by those running the smuggling network, or simply ordinary administrative inefficiency, remains impossible to confirm from surviving records. What seems historically clear is that the volume of skooma moving through certain holds during this period substantially exceeded what occasional random enforcement would have consistently failed to detect. The specific routes used to move skooma through Skyrim's mountains reflect sophisticated geographic knowledge of terrain that ordinary trade maps never documented. Passes that were too narrow, too steep, or too seasonally unreliable for regular commercial traffic remained perfectly adequate for small groups moving valuable and compact cargo without needing to share roads with legitimate travelers. A theory holds that the mountain route network developed for skooma distribution drew on older knowledge, paths known to hunters, herders, and local communities that had never been incorporated into any official geography. This older knowledge would have been available to anyone with sufficient patience to acquire it through local connection rather than official cartography. Some historians believe the earliest smugglers hired local guides specifically for their knowledge of unmapped terrain, with these guides eventually becoming integrated into the smuggling operation rather than remaining simple hired help. The mountain terrain itself, indifferent to whatever was being carried across it, provided the most effective concealment available without requiring any active deception on the smuggler's part. Whether any businesses currently operating in Skyrim's southern holds trace their founding capital to the skooma trade represents a question most family histories and business records are unlikely to answer honestly, even if the connection exists. Capital generated through illegal means needs legitimate channels through which to become visible in the regular economy. A theory holds that several prosperous families in Falkreath and the Rift used profits from early skooma distribution to fund what appeared to be entirely conventional investments in land, livestock, and local commerce. These investments, once established, generated legitimate returns that quickly became indistinguishable from capital with entirely clean origins. Within a generation or two, the original source of the founding investment would be completely invisible to any external observer, and possibly to the family themselves, if information was deliberately withheld from younger generations. Whether any specific currently operating establishment can be traced to this origin, no responsible scholar would claim to confirm without considerably more direct evidence than currently exists. The theory rests on probability and pattern, rather than any specific traceable connection, which is precisely why it remains theory rather than established fact. The skooma trade grew considerably faster in some holds than others, and the pattern of this uneven growth tells its own quiet story about Skyrim's social and economic geography during this period. Falkreath and the Rift show evidence of earlier and more established trade presence than the Pale or Winterhold in the north. Some historians attribute this simply to geography, since both Falkreath and the Rift sit closer to the southern border, where supply lines from Cyrodiil and ultimately elsewhere would have been shorter and more reliable. Others believe the difference reflects social factors, with certain hold populations showing more openness to trade in controlled substances than others whose cultural identity centered more strongly on social conservatism. A theory holds that the growth pattern also reflects deliberate strategic decisions by whoever organized the early trade, choosing to establish distribution in holds where complicity was most available before attempting expansion into more resistant territory. This strategic patience, if real, would indicate more organizational sophistication than most accounts of early smuggling operations tend to credit. Building from strength rather than attempting simultaneous expansion across all available territory is the kind of decision that reflects experience rather than opportunism. Some of the individuals who moved skooma through Skyrim during this earlier period left faint traces in records that were never intended to document their actual activities. Tax records show individuals with no clear legitimate occupation paying what appear to be legitimate taxes in amounts inconsistent with any conventional livelihood available in their declared location. Travel records from certain holds show the same names appearing at distant waypoints, in patterns that make no sense for ordinary commercial travel, but perfect sense for courier activity on a fixed smuggling route. A theory holds that careful cross-referencing of these administrative fragments across multiple different hold archives would allow partial reconstruction of several individual careers in the early skooma trade. Whether any scholar has ever undertaken this specific research project, and whether any results from it exist in published form, remains unknown. The fragments themselves survive in hold archives because no one connected them at the time of their creation, and because archivists later preserved them without understanding what a complete picture of them might reveal. The social geography of skooma consumption in Skyrim during this period reflected existing class structure more than it disrupted it. Some historians believe early skooma used concentrated primarily among those with disposable resources for non-essential goods, creating a customer base that included enough wealthy individuals to keep detection consequences manageable. A wealthy user has considerably more capacity to avoid legal consequences than a poor one, which tends to shape which users become visible in enforcement records. A theory holds that early enforcement focused selectively on users without resources to resist prosecution, creating a misleading impression in official records of who actually comprised the consumer population. This selective enforcement pattern, common across many different legal contexts, effectively protected the trade's most economically valuable customers, while creating the appearance of active suppression. Whether hold authorities understood this dynamic consciously and exploited it deliberately, or simply followed the path of least resistance without strategic intention, the practical effect on the trade's continued operation would have been similar in either case. The routes used to move skooma through Skyrim occasionally intersected with routes used for entirely legitimate purposes, creating opportunities for concealment that sophisticated smugglers would have been quick to recognize. Wool merchants, traveling healers, and itinerant craftspeople moved through similar mountain terrain, using similar small group travel patterns. Some historians believe the early smuggling network deliberately mimicked the travel patterns of these legitimate travelers, using the same rest stops, the same travel schedules, and in some cases, the same intermediate handlers who had no idea what they were actually moving alongside conventional goods. This deliberate mimicry would have made distinguishing smuggling activity from legitimate travel considerably more difficult for any guard attempting to do so on the basis of observable behavior alone. A theory holds that certain legitimate merchant networks were either knowingly or unknowingly integrated into smuggling operations as cover. Their conventional activity providing camouflage that no amount of observation could easily penetrate. Whether any of these legitimate merchants understood their role in the system, and whether any sought to extricate themselves once they realized it, no surviving record clearly addresses. The Thieves' Guild, operating across Skyrim and maintaining connections to similar organizations in Cyrodiil, would have been aware of the skooma trade's operation through their territories, regardless of whether they directly participated in running it. A theory holds that the guild's relationship to the early skooma trade was neither direct participation nor active opposition, but rather a form of quiet toleration in exchange for informal arrangements that benefited both parties. The guild's primary interest was in maintaining functional criminal infrastructure, and a well-organized smuggling network represented exactly the kind of operational capacity the guild could periodically find useful for entirely different purposes. Whether the guild collected any kind of informal tax from skooma operations moving through their territory remains entirely speculative, since neither the guild nor the smuggling networks involved left documentation of any such arrangement. What seems historically plausible is that two sophisticated criminal operations occupying the same geographic territory would inevitably develop some kind of working relationship, whether formal or simply consisting of mutual awareness and non-interference. The roads that moved skooma through Skyrim for a century, without appearing on any official map, are still there. Mountains do not close their passes simply because the trade using them finally attracted enough attention to slow down. Some of those routes likely still carry things that official maps do not acknowledge, since the geographic features that made them useful for smuggling in one era do not change simply because one particular trade eventually ran its course. Somewhere in the hills between Falkreath and the border, a path worn by years of careful, quiet feet still exists, indistinguishable from any other narrow way through the rock. It keeps no record of what crossed it, and the mountain keeps no record either. Every hagraven was once something else. Every one of them stood at a moment where a choice was made, or something that felt like a choice, and crossed a line that does not allow return. Hagravens are among the most distinctive creatures found anywhere in Skyrim's wilderness. They move with a hunched, angular quality, their bodies bent in ways that suggest the frame beneath them was once shaped differently. Their faces carry traces of something older, something that might once have been recognizably human, or at least recognizably mortal, worn thin by whatever process brought them to their current form. Most travelers who encounter hagravens in the wild focus on surviving the encounter rather than observing these details carefully. Scholars who have studied them from a safer distance note consistently that hagravens behave with a kind of intelligence that pure beasts do not demonstrate. They organize, they maintain covens, they perform rituals with clear structural logic, and they appear to retain memories that span long periods of time. This combination of monstrous appearance and preserved intelligence is precisely what makes them so unsettling, and precisely what keeps the question of their transformation so persistently interesting to those who study them. Whether the transformation that creates a hagraven is entirely voluntary represents the most fundamental question surrounding this ritual. Some scholars insist the choice must be genuine, since the ritual's complexity appears to require active participation rather than passive submission. A ritual that could be performed on an unwilling subject would look very different from what accounts of hagraven transformation actually describe. Others argue that by the time a witch reaches the moment of transformation, the surrounding circumstances have already narrowed her options so severely that calling the final choice fully free becomes philosophically questionable. A coven that has spent years preparing a member for this moment, shaping her beliefs, isolating her from outside influence, and defining her entire identity around this coming transformation, has already removed most of the conditions under which a genuinely free choice could be made. A theory holds that the ritual itself contains a moment of genuine decision, a threshold the witch must cross through her own active will, but that everything surrounding that moment is carefully constructed to make crossing it feel not just possible, but inevitable. Whether this construction invalidates the freedom of the final step, or whether a freely chosen step remains free regardless of how it was prepared for, depends on philosophical commitments most scholars hold differently from each other. Hagraven covens concentrate near old reach shrines, with a consistency that goes well beyond coincidence or simple preference for isolated locations. The reach contains many kinds of isolated terrain, including caves, mountain valleys, and abandoned Nordic ruins, that would serve the basic practical requirements of a hidden coven, just as well as any ancient shrine site. Yet Hagravens specifically prefer the shrine sites, returning to them across generations in ways that suggest these locations matter, for reasons beyond simple practicality. Some scholars believe old reach shrines sit on ground that has been ritually significant for long enough that it has developed genuine spiritual properties, a kind of accumulated charge from centuries of worship and practice. A theory holds that Hagraven transformation rituals draw on this accumulated spiritual energy, making shrine sites not simply preferred, but actually necessary for the ritual to function correctly. The shrine's history becomes a kind of infrastructure, supporting what the ritual requires in ways that ordinary ground simply cannot provide. Whether this accumulated spiritual charge is a real phenomenon or a theological belief that covens hold without objective basis remains genuinely difficult to determine from outside the ritual itself. Beyond the obvious and dramatic physical transformation, the Hagraven ritual appears to demand costs that extend deeper than appearance alone. Some scholars who have studied Hagraven behavior over extended periods note that former witches who successfully transformed appear to have lost certain cognitive and emotional capacities they demonstrably possessed beforehand. The ability to form new close personal bonds, for example, appears significantly diminished or entirely absent in Hagravens, compared to what accounts of their pre-transformation lives describe. A theory holds that the ritual literally trades specific aspects of the witch's humanity, not metaphorically, but in some mechanically real sense, in exchange for the power it grants. Empathy, attachment, and vulnerability may be precisely the things surrendered, since these are the qualities most incompatible with the kind of power the transformation provides. Power that operates through fear and domination cannot coexist comfortably with a nature that genuinely feels the suffering of others. Whether this trade is explicitly understood by the witch beforehand, or whether it becomes clear only after the transformation is complete and irreversible, most accounts do not clearly specify. Whether any witch has ever successfully reversed a Hagraven transformation is a question that produces strongly held disagreement among the scholars who take it seriously. Some maintain that no confirmed reversal has ever occurred, making the transformation effectively permanent by all available evidence. Others argue the absence of confirmed reversals reflects practical obstacles rather than inherent impossibility, since any witch who managed to reverse the process would have every reason to disappear quietly rather than submit to scholarly documentation of her experience. A theory holds that reversal is theoretically possible, but requires conditions so specific and resources so rare that it has never been accomplished under circumstances where credible witnesses were present. The ritual created something real and persistent, not a costume that can simply be removed, but the forces that created it operate according to rules that might theoretically be run in reverse under the right conditions. Whether anyone has ever identified those conditions with sufficient precision to attempt a reversal and survived the attempt remains entirely unconfirmed. Most covens treat the question as irrelevant rather than impossible, since the transformation is understood as a destination rather than a passage through. The requirement for complete isolation from outside witnesses during Hagraven transformation appears consistently across different accounts from different regions of Skyrim. Covens that otherwise maintain some limited contact with the outside world close that contact entirely during the transformation period. Members who have not yet undergone transformation are sometimes excluded from the ritual's final stages, keeping even the internal coven largely ignorant of the ritual's most specific details. A theory holds that witness presence actively disrupts something the ritual requires, not through any romantic idea about observation changing outcomes, but through a more specific magical mechanism. Some rituals in Tamriel are understood to require a closed, energetic system, with any external presence creating leakage that weakens or distorts the intended effect. If Hagraven transformation operates on similar principles, The exclusion of witnesses would be a technical requirement, rather than simply a preference for secrecy. Others argue the isolation serves social rather than magical purposes, ensuring that no witness can later describe what actually occurred in terms that might invite intervention, rescue attempts, or the kind of legal attention that open testimony tends to attract. Whether the isolation is magically necessary, socially strategic, or both simultaneously, it is too consistent, across too many accounts, to be simply a coincidental preference. The plants and materials used in Hagraven transformation rituals appear with enough consistency across different accounts to suggest a real, transmissible knowledge tradition rather than independent invention by separate covens. Specific combinations of ingredients appear again and again, including materials that are difficult to acquire and that would require significant advanced planning rather than improvised gathering. A theory holds that this consistency reflects a genuine lineage of transmitted knowledge, passed from existing Hagravens to witches being prepared for transformation across many generations. If true, this would mean each Hagraven transformation carries within it knowledge inherited from previous transformations, stretching back to whatever original moment this practice first developed. The knowledge itself would be a kind of continuous thread, running from the first transformation to the most recent one, connecting every Hagraven who ever existed through shared inherited practice. Whether this lineage can be traced to a specific origin point, a first transformation from which all subsequent knowledge descends, no surviving account clearly indicates. What seems clear is that the knowledge is real, specific, and carefully preserved, rather than loosely improvised. Some scholars believe the timing of Hagraven transformation correlates with specific celestial or seasonal conditions, occurring during windows that covens identify through their own observational tradition, rather than conventional calendrical reckoning. This would explain why transformations are not distributed evenly across the year, but instead cluster around specific periods that vary from the conventional religious calendar that most Skyrim communities follow. A theory holds that these timing windows reflect genuine sensitivity in the boundary between ordinary reality and whatever forces the ritual draws upon, with certain astronomical configurations, creating conditions that make the transformation more stable or more powerful than it would be at other times. Whether this sensitivity is a real feature of how the ritual operates, or simply a belief that covens maintain without objective basis, remains impossible to determine from outside observation. What can be noted is that covens take this timing seriously enough to delay or postpone transformation, rather than proceed at an unfavorable moment, suggesting they genuinely believe the difference between timing matters in practical rather than symbolic terms. The relationship between a completed Hagraven and any witches still awaiting transformation within the same coven carries unusual psychological weight that some scholars find deeply worth examining. A Hagraven, who was recently a member of the same coven, now occupies an entirely different category of being, having crossed a threshold her companions have not yet reached. Some accounts suggest this creates a peculiar tension, with the remaining witches relating to the transformed member differently, even when they have spent years preparing for this exact outcome together. A theory holds that the transformation creates a genuine experiential rupture that no amount of intellectual preparation fully bridges, since understanding that someone will become a Hagraven is entirely different from continuing to relate to her after she already has. The Hagraven herself may find the relationship equally altered, her transformed perceptions and reduced emotional range changing how former companions appear to her. Whether this rupture is understood by covens as part of the transformation's cost, or simply as an unavoidable consequence that receives less attention than the physical changes, remains unclear from available accounts. What seems consistent is that the coven after a transformation is a different social structure than the coven before it, regardless of how unchanged the external membership appears. Old Reach oral tradition preserves stories about transformation that predate any written account of Hagraven practice, describing a time when the boundary between powerful witch and something beyond witch was understood differently than it came to be understood later. Some of these older stories describe transformation as a two-directional possibility, with movement across the threshold running in both directions rather than only one. Others describe the transformed figure as permanently elevated rather than permanently altered, suggesting the original cultural framework around this practice was considerably more positive than the understanding that eventually replaced it. A theory holds that the current understanding of Hagraven transformation as inherently monstrous reflects cultural change rather than any change in the transformation itself, with the same practice being reinterpreted across generations from something honored to something feared. If the practice remained essentially consistent, while its cultural meaning shifted dramatically, this would explain both why Hagravens retain deep connections to old Reach tradition, and why the wider world has come to view them so differently from how that tradition originally understood them. The transformation may be the same thing it always was. What changed is the story told about it by those who were not the ones choosing to undergo it. The Hagraven stands at the edge of what mortal transformation can accomplish and still leave something recognizable behind. Whatever the ritual demands, whatever it costs, whatever it permanently closes off, it produces something that has survived in Skyrim's wilderness for centuries, without any external support or institutional protection. A coven maintains itself, transmits its knowledge, and continues producing transformations across generations, entirely outside the structures of any hold, any temple, or any established order. The ritual keeps happening, quietly, in isolated places, near stones older than any name currently attached to them. Long after this chapter rests, somewhere in the Reach, something is being prepared that will not look the same when it is finished. An army announces itself with sound and movement. An intelligence network announces itself with nothing at all, which is precisely how it prefers to operate. Thalmor's presence in Skyrim before the Civil War is well enough documented in general terms. Their justiciars moving through holds, their embassy established near Solitude, their formal diplomatic position maintained, with the kind of visible confidence that serves as its own form of intimidation. What receives considerably less attention is the quieter, more patient work that preceded and accompanied this visible presence. The systematic gathering and transmission of information through networks of correspondence that left minimal official trace. A theory holds that the Thalmor's intelligence operation in Skyrim was considerably more developed before the Civil War than their relatively modest formal presence suggested, with correspondence networks mapping political, social, and military conditions across the holds in detail that would have been genuinely useful for planning purposes. Some of this correspondence has surfaced in fragmented form in hold archives, discovered mixed among routine administrative documents by archivists who did not always recognize what they had found. These fragments, where they exist and where scholars have managed to study them carefully, raise more questions than they settle about the true scope of what was happening. Whether the ciphers used in Thalmor correspondence found in Skyrim reflect old Aldmeri record-keeping traditions represents a genuinely interesting question about the relationship between cultural practice and intelligence tradecraft. Some scholars who have examined surviving fragments note organizational features that resemble administrative conventions used in Aldmeri bureaucratic records predating the Thalmor as a political entity by several centuries. A theory holds that Thalmor intelligence methodology drew deliberately on older Aldmeri administrative traditions, adapting record-keeping practices, originally developed for archival purposes, into cipher systems that functioned effectively precisely because their structural logic was unfamiliar to non-Aldmeri readers. A cipher built on bureaucratic conventions, only recognizable to those trained in a specific archival tradition, would be effectively opaque to anyone without that background, regardless of whether they suspected a cipher was present. This would make the Aldmeri record-keeping tradition not simply a cultural legacy, but an active operational security tool. Its obscurity to outsiders, functioning as protection for correspondence that needed to travel through environments where interception was always possible. The deliberate destruction of documents by burning rather than filing represents a departure from normal archival practice, significant enough to invite explanation. Organizations that routinely burn correspondence are organizations that have made a considered decision that certain information should not survive beyond its immediate operational usefulness. Some scholars believe Thalmor correspondence in Skyrim was subject to a formal destruction protocol, with certain categories of document required to be burned after their contents had been acted upon or transmitted further up the organizational hierarchy. A theory holds that the documents destroyed most aggressively were precisely those most useful for later reconstruction of the network's true scope, specifically the ones naming local contacts, describing specific observations made about individual holds or figures, and documenting the organizational structure of the network itself. What survived was either destroyed incompletely through operational failure or represents categories of document considered less sensitive, which means surviving fragments may systematically underrepresent the network's most sensitive activities. Studying only what was not destroyed produces a picture shaped by what the Thalmor considered safe to leave behind, which may be considerably less revealing than what they chose to eliminate. Which holds the Thalmor watched most closely before the Civil War can be partially reconstructed from the geographic distribution of surviving correspondence fragments, though this reconstruction carries the caveat that destruction was uneven and may not reflect actual surveillance priorities accurately. Some scholars note a higher concentration of surviving fragments associated with holds in the western and northern parts of Skyrim, which might reflect either greater Thalmor interest in those regions or simply better archival survival rates in those areas. A theory holds that the Thalmor paid particular attention to holds showing signs of political instability, not because instability was itself their goal, but because unstable political environments produce more information worth gathering, and more individuals willing to provide it, in exchange for various forms of support. A hold where existing political arrangements are under pressure contains more people with grievances, ambitions, or anxieties that make them receptive to approaches from outside organizations, offering resources, protection, or simply sympathetic attention. Whether the Thalmor actively encouraged the political conditions they were also monitoring, or simply positioned themselves to benefit from conditions developing independently, is a question the surviving fragments do not definitively answer. Whether local scribes in Skyrim's minor holds were knowingly or unknowingly recruited to assist Thalmor correspondence operations represents one of the more personally interesting dimensions of this larger story. Hold scribes in smaller settlements often supplemented their income through copying, translation, and document preparation work for travelers and merchants who passed through. A scribe hired to copy a document in a language they did not read would have no way of knowing what they were actually handling, particularly if the person hiring them provided a plausible conventional explanation for the work. A theory holds that certain Thalmor correspondence was routed through local scribes specifically to introduce a layer of operational separation between the content and the Thalmor personnel who needed it transmitted. If anything went wrong, the scribes' genuine ignorance would make them a dead end for investigators, rather than a productive lead. Whether any Skyrim scribes ever came to understand what they had been used for, and what they did with that understanding if they did, remains the kind of personal story that official records almost never preserve. The scribes themselves, being of insufficient social status to appear in most surviving documentation, simply vanish from any possible reconstruction of their own role in events that involved them directly. What the pattern of Thalmor correspondence, taken as a whole, suggests about how military and political campaigns are prepared through information gathering before any open action begins, carries implications that extend well beyond Skyrim specifically. A theory holds that the correspondence network documented here represents a standard methodology rather than a specifically Skyrim-focused operation, applied with similar structure across multiple regions simultaneously, as part of a systematic approach to intelligence preparation. If true, the fragments found in Skyrim hold archives represent a local sample of something much larger, a continental intelligence operation that predated the Civil War by decades and covered far more territory than any single region's surviving records reveal. Understanding what the Thalmor knew about Skyrim before any soldier moved toward its borders would require assembling fragments from multiple hold archives, cross-referencing them for patterns, and accepting that the most sensitive material was likely destroyed before anyone began looking for it. The picture that emerges from available fragments is therefore necessarily incomplete, a partial window into a systematic operation designed from the beginning to leave as small a traceable record as possible. Some of the coded correspondence found in hold archives contains what scholars believe are references to specific individuals by initial or descriptor rather than full name, suggesting the Thalmor tracked particular people as part of their information-gathering activity. These references are impossible to connect to specific historical individuals with any confidence, since the descriptors used are deliberately vague and the coding conventions are not fully understood. A theory holds that among these tracked individuals were local officials, merchants with cross-border connections, scholars with access to historical or geographical knowledge, and military figures whose competence or loyalty represented variables worth monitoring. Tracking specific individuals rather than simply geographic areas or political situations represents a more granular and operationally intensive form of intelligence work, requiring regular updates as tracked individuals changed roles, relocated, or died. Whether the Thalmor maintained this level of individual tracking consistently across the holds, or concentrated it in specific areas, or on specific categories of person, the surviving fragments do not allow confident determination. The physical materials of surviving correspondence fragments tell their own story alongside whatever content they contain. Some scholars who have examined original fragments note paper quality, ink composition, and binding techniques that differ subtly from those typically used in Skyrim hold administration during the same period. A theory holds that Thalmor correspondence used materials sourced specifically to distinguish sensitive documents from routine administrative paperwork for those who knew what to look for, while remaining indistinguishable from ordinary correspondence to those who did not. This material distinction would have allowed Thalmor personnel receiving documents to identify authentic correspondence at a glance through the physical characteristics of the material itself, rather than depending solely on the content or coding. Whether this represents a systematic material security protocol or simply reflects the Thalmor's access to different supply chains than typical Skyrim administration, the physical distinctiveness of surviving fragments is real enough that several scholars have independently noted it without coordination. The language in which Thalmor correspondence was written, where fragments are sufficiently intact to identify it, presents its own complications for reconstruction. Some fragments appear to be written in standard Tamrielic, others in what appears to be a form of Aldmeri, and at least one scholar has identified a fragment, apparently using both languages within the same document, according to a switching convention that may itself encode additional information. A theory holds that multilingual correspondence conventions served operational security purposes, since a reader, competent in one language but not the other, would recover only partial content from any given document. Whether this multilingual approach was systematic or simply reflects different personnel with different language backgrounds handling different parts of the correspondence network. Surviving fragments do not allow confident determination. What seems clear is that the correspondence was not designed for easy reading by anyone who happened to come across it, regardless of whether they recognized it as sensitive in the first place. Some scholars who study the broader pattern of Thalmor activity in Skyrim before the Civil War believe the correspondence network represented preparation for multiple possible outcomes rather than a single intended one. Intelligence networks, when functioning optimally, gather information that supports decision-making across a range of scenarios rather than simply confirming a predetermined course of action. A theory holds that the Thalmor correspondence in Skyrim was gathering information useful for responding effectively, whether the Civil War ended with Imperial victory, Stormcloak victory, or some form of negotiated resolution, since each outcome would have created different strategic conditions requiring different responses. This kind of scenario-neutral intelligence preparation reflects sophisticated organizational thinking rather than simple advocacy for a particular outcome. Whether the Thalmor ultimately found the information gathered through this network useful for whatever decisions they eventually faced, and whether the network's dissolution, through the exposure of certain operational elements, compromised its effectiveness before those decisions were made, the surviving fragments alone cannot determine. The letters traveled further than their senders perhaps intended, surviving in hold archives and scholarly collections long past the moment when they were supposed to become irrelevant or disappear entirely. Documents have their own kind of persistence, finding ways to outlast the operational contexts that created them through the simple accident of being filed rather than burned, discovered rather than overlooked, recognized rather than dismissed. Whatever the Thalmor network in Skyrim was actually doing, whatever its full scope and ambition, the fragments that survive give it a kind of inadvertent permanence that the network's designers almost certainly did not intend. Information gathered quietly, transmitted carefully, and largely destroyed afterwards still leaves traces. The letters that traveled furthest were the ones no one remembered to burn,